The knock on the door came at midnight, and Elena knew before she opened it that her life was about to end in one way and begin in another. Her father stood there with his hands folded in front of him like a man about to pray, but there was no prayer in his eyes. There was only shame, and behind the shame, relief. She saw it clearly, the way a person sees a crack in glass, right before it shatters. "They are here," he said. "The Shadowfang envoy. You need to come now." Elena did not move. Her bare feet stayed rooted to the cold wooden floor of her room, the only room she had ever slept in, the only walls that had ever kept her safe. "Come where, father? It is midnight. Whatever business you have with Shadowfang can wait until morning." "It cannot wait," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the sentence like a branch under too much weight. "I made a promise. I signed the agreement 3 days ago. Tonight it becomes final." "What agreement?" He did not answer with words. He simply stepped aside, and behind him, at the end of the hallway, stood 2 men she did not recognize. They wore black coats with silver stitching along the collar, a mark she had seen only once before, painted on a banner during a trade meeting between packs. The mark of Shadowfang, the most feared pack in the Northern Territories, ruled by a king whose name alone made grown wolves lower their eyes. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her, though nothing had physically moved. "Father, what have you done?" "I saved us," he whispered. "I saved everyone." The 2 men stepped forward, and one of them, older, with a scar along his jaw, spoke in a low and steady voice. "Miss Voss, we are here to escort you to Shadowfang territory. You have 3 days to prepare. The Alpha King requires your presence at the pack grounds by sunset on the 3rd day." "Requires," Elena repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word, "as though I am cargo to be delivered." "You are the payment," the man said simply, without cruelty, as though stating the weather. "Your father owed a debt that could not be settled in gold or land. Shadowfang accepted you instead." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of her body. She looked past the men, past her father, toward the small window at the end of the hall where moonlight spilled onto the floor in a pale silver square. She thought of running. She thought of every story she had heard about wolves who tried to escape their fate, and how those stories always ended the same way, with the runner dragged back in chains, or worse, never seen again. 3 days, she said quietly. 3 days. 3 days, the man confirmed. They left without another word, their boots echoing down the stone steps of the house, until the sound faded into the night. Elena turned to her father, and for the first time in her life, she did not see him as her protector. She saw him as a man who had traded his daughter to save his own skin, and the sight of him made something inside her go cold and quiet, like a fire doused with water. "How much did we owe them?" she asked. "It does not matter now. How much, father?" He looked at the floor. "Enough to end our pack if it went unpaid. Enough that Shadowfang could have taken our land, our people, everything we have built for 3 generations. I had no choice, Elena. I begged them for another arrangement. They said no. The only thing that would satisfy the debt was a mate for their king." "A mate," she said, and the word tasted strange in her mouth. Foreign, like a language she had never learned. "You sold me as a wife to a stranger." "I saved this pack," he said again, as though repeating it enough times would make it true, would make it kind. "You will be treated well. Shadowfang does not harm its Luna. You will have a title, a home, protection beyond anything I could give you here. I do not want protection bought with my own freedom." Her voice rose, sharp and clear in the quiet house. "I want to choose my own life." Her father said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked back toward his study, leaving Elena alone in the hallway with the moonlight and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding too loud in her ears. She did not sleep that night. She sat by her window and watched the stars move slowly across the sky, and she thought about the man she was being sent to, the Alpha King of Shadowfang. She had heard his name whispered in fear at every gathering, every trade meeting, every council of packs. Damian Cross. A king who had taken his throne through strength no one could match, who had never lost a fight, who ruled with an iron will that made even his own commanders careful in how they spoke to him. She imagined him as a shadow with no face, a figure built entirely of rumor and fear. Some said he was cruel to anyone who crossed him, Some said he had never taken a mate because no one had ever survived being close to him long enough to earn the bond. Some said stranger things still, that he searched every pack gathering with a strange restlessness, as though looking for someone who was always just out of reach. None of the stories comforted her. All of them frightened her in different ways. The next morning, her packmates learned the news, and the house filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional whisper. Some of the younger wolves looked at her with pity. A few of the older ones, the ones who remembered what her father's debts had cost the pack over the years, looked almost grateful, as though her sacrifice was simply the price that needed to be paid, and they were relieved it was not theirs to pay. Only one person came to her honestly. Her closest friend, a young woman named Mira, found her sitting alone near the training grounds, where the pack's young wolves practiced their forms every morning. Mira sat beside her without a word for a long moment, letting the silence settle between them before she finally spoke. "I heard," Mira said. "Everyone has heard," Elena replied. "It seems my father wanted the entire pack to know before he told me himself. What will you do?" Elena stared out at the training grounds, at the wolves moving through their drills in perfect unison, strong and certain in a way she did not feel at all. "I do not know. I have 3 days to prepare for a life I never chose, with a man I have never met, in a pack known for its fear, rather than its warmth." "You could run," Mira said quietly. "I would help you. We could leave tonight, before the Shadowfang men return." For a moment, Elena let herself imagine it. A life on the run, free from the arrangement, free from her father's debt, free from the pack that had failed to protect her from being used as currency. But she knew, even as she imagined it, that it was a fantasy with no real foundation. Shadowfang would not simply let their payment vanish. They would search, and when they found her, whatever mercy might have existed in this arrangement would be gone entirely. Worse, her pack would suffer for her escape. Whatever protection her father believed this arrangement bought them would turn instead into punishment. "I cannot run," Elena said finally. "Not because I am not afraid to, because if I run, everyone here pays the price for it. I will not let that happen, because of my own fear." Mira reached over and took her hand, holding it tightly. "Then, I will not let you go into this alone, not even in spirit. Whatever happens to you, you are still the strongest person I know. You will find a way to survive this. You always do." Elena squeezed her friend's hand back, grateful for a kindness she had not expected to receive that morning. And for a moment, the fear inside her chest eased, just slightly, replaced by something steadier. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. The next 2 days passed in a strange blur of preparation and dread. Elena packed only what she needed, refusing the elaborate wardrobe her father tried to offer, as though fine clothing could make up for what he had done. She visited the places she loved most in her childhood home, the stream where she had learned to swim, the hill where she had watched her first sunrise as a wolf, the old oak tree where she and Mira had carved their names as children. She said quiet goodbyes to each of them, not knowing if she would ever see them again. On the evening of the second day, her father found her alone in the garden, and for the first time since the night of the announcement, he tried to speak with her honestly. "I know you hate me," he said. "I do not hate you," Elena replied, surprising herself with how true the words felt. "I am disappointed in you. There is a difference. Hate would mean I expected better, and was betrayed. Disappointment means I always suspected you might choose the pack over me, and now I have my answer." Her father flinched as though she had struck him. "I never wanted this for you. But you chose it anyway." He had no answer for that. He simply stood beside her in the quiet garden, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small pendant on a silver chain, pressing it into her palm. "This belonged to your mother," he said. "She would have wanted you to have it, wherever you end up. It was passed to her by her own mother, and to her by hers, back through generations further than anyone in our family can properly remember. It is said to protect the wearer from harm, though I never put much faith in such old stories." Elena closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling the cool metal against her skin. It was shaped like a small crescent moon, worn smooth by decades of handling. "Thank you," she said quietly, and though her anger toward him had not faded, she found she could not refuse this one small piece of her mother, who had died when Elena was too young to remember her face clearly. On the morning of the third day, the Shadowfang envoy returned exactly as promised, arriving with the same silent precision they had shown on their first visit. This time there were 4 of them, along with a carriage drawn by 2 black horses, their coats gleaming like polished stone in the early light. Elena stood at the edge of the pack grounds with her small bag of belongings and the pendant hidden beneath her collar, and she watched the carriage approach with a strange sense of unreality, as though she were watching this happen to someone else entirely, some character in a story, rather than her own actual life. The scarred man who had spoken to her before stepped forward and inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was almost respectful. "Miss Voss, are you ready to depart?" "Do I have a choice?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I find it easier when people believe they do, even briefly." Something about his honesty struck her as strangely comforting, a small kindness, in the middle of an arrangement built entirely on cruelty. She nodded and allowed herself to be led toward the carriage, refusing to look back at her father, or the pack grounds she had called home for her entire life. She knew if she looked back, she might lose the fragile courage she had spent 3 days building, piece by piece, and she needed every piece of it for whatever waited on the other side of this journey. The carriage ride to Shadowfang territory took the better part of a day, winding through forests that grew darker and denser the further north they traveled. Elena watched the landscape change through the small window, the familiar rolling hills of her home giving way to steep mountains and thick pine forests that blocked out most of the sunlight. She had never traveled this far from home before, and despite everything, some small part of her could not help but notice the strange beauty of the unfamiliar land, wild and untamed in a way her own territory had never been. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, the carriage crested a final ridge, and Elena caught her first glimpse of Shadowfang territory spread out below them. It was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected something harsh and fortress-like, built entirely for war and dominance. Instead, she saw a sprawling settlement nestled in a wide valley, surrounded by tall stone walls that seemed built more for protection than for menace. Smoke rose gently from dozens of chimneys, and even from this distance, she could see wolves moving through the streets below, going about ordinary evening business, as though this were any other pack in any other part of the world. At the center of the settlement stood a large hall, built from dark stone and timber, larger than any building Elena had ever seen, its windows glowing warm with firelight against the falling darkness. She knew instinctively that this was where she was being taken, and her heart began to pound harder with every passing moment, as the carriage descended toward the valley floor. The gates opened before them, without any signal that Elena could see, and the carriage rolled through into a wide courtyard, where a small group of wolves stood waiting. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her bag and prepared to step down, bracing herself for whatever cruelty or coldness awaited her inside those walls. But when the carriage door opened and she stepped out into the cool evening air, the first thing she noticed was not cruelty at all. It was silence. Complete and total silence, as every wolf in that courtyard turned to look at her, and for a moment, nobody moved or spoke, as though the entire pack had been holding its breath, waiting for this exact moment to arrive. And then, from the doorway of the great hall, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark clothing that seemed designed more for movement than for show. Elena could not see his face clearly in the fading light, but she felt something shift in the air the moment he stepped into view, a kind of pressure that pressed against her skin, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wolves in the courtyard bowed their heads as he passed among them, and Elena understood, without needing to be told, that this was him. The Alpha King, Damien Cross. He stopped a few paces away from her, close enough now that she could finally see his face in the torchlight, and whatever she had expected, whatever stories she had built in her mind over the past 3 days, none of them had prepared her for the way he looked at her in that moment. There was no cruelty in his eyes, there was no coldness, no dismissal, none of the things she had steeled herself to endure. Instead, there was something that looked almost like disbelief, as though he too could not quite believe she was standing there in front of him. His eyes moved over her face slowly, carefully, as though he were memorizing every detail, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, far quieter than she had expected from a man whose name alone inspired fear across an entire territory. "You came," he said, and there was something strange in the way he said it, something that sounded almost like relief, though Elena could not begin to understand why. I did not have much choice in the matter, she replied, lifting her chin slightly, refusing to let her fear show on her face, even as her heart continued to pound against her ribs. Something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to name, gone before she could study it properly. No, he said quietly. I suppose you did not. He paused, and for a moment, the silence stretched long enough that Elena wondered if he would say anything else at all. Then he extended one hand toward her, not commanding, not demanding, simply offering. Welcome to Shadowfang, Elena Voss. Whatever you were told to expect here, I promise you it will not be that. Elena stared at his outstretched hand, uncertain whether to trust the strange gentleness in his voice, uncertain whether any of this could possibly be as simple as it appeared. Every instinct she had built over 3 days of fear told her to be careful, to expect the worst, to brace herself for whatever cruelty might still be waiting beneath this calm surface. But standing there in the flickering torchlight, surrounded by silent wolves and the enormous stone walls of a place she had never wanted to call home, Elena found herself reaching out and placing her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, something passed between them, a warmth that spread up her arm and settled deep in her chest, unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. Whatever this place was, whatever this man truly was beneath the fear his name inspired across the Northern Territories, Elena understood in that single quiet moment that her life had just changed, in a way far larger than she had prepared herself for, and there was no going back to the person she had been 3 days ago. He did not let go of her hand right away. Instead, he turned slightly, guiding her forward toward the great hall, while the watching wolves parted to let them pass. Elena felt every eye in the courtyard following her, some curious, some cautious, a few openly startled, as though her arrival had disturbed something long settled in this place. She kept her back straight and her chin level, refusing to let the weight of so many stares bend her posture, even though her legs felt unsteady beneath her, with every step across the stone courtyard. Near the entrance to the hall, a tall woman, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes, stepped forward and inclined her head toward the king. My lord, shall I have the western chambers prepared for our guest? Yes, Damien said, and send for warm food. She has traveled a long way today. The woman's gaze flicked toward Elena, quick and searching, before she nodded and turned to give orders to a pair of younger wolves standing nearby. Elena noted the way the entire pack seemed to move around Damien with a kind of practiced efficiency, as though every person here understood their role and performed it without needing to be told twice. It was nothing like the loose, familiar chaos of her own pack back home, where orders were often more like suggestions, and everyone spoke freely regardless of rank. Inside, the great hall was warmer than she expected, lit by enormous hearths on either side, and lined with long wooden tables that stood mostly empty at this late hour. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat, and despite the tight knot of anxiety still sitting in her stomach, Elena felt her body respond to the warmth after the long, cold carriage ride, some small animal comfort finding its way through the fear. Damien finally released her hand once they were inside, and the sudden absence of his touch left her skin oddly cool, a sensation she did not have time to examine before he spoke again. You must have questions, he said. I imagine you have had very few honest answers over the past 3 days. That would be an accurate assessment, Elena said carefully, watching his face for any sign of mockery and finding none. My father told me almost nothing beyond the fact that I was being sent here to settle his debt. Your envoy told me only that I was required by sunset on the 3rd day, as though I were a package with a delivery date. Something tightened briefly around his jaw, there and then gone. That was not how I intended for this to be handled, he said, and his voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like anger, though it was clearly not directed at her. I gave clear instructions that you were to be treated with respect, from the very first moment my people made contact with your pack. I will address it. Elena studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the stories she had heard about this man with the person now standing in front of her, speaking with quiet frustration about the treatment of a woman he had, by all accounts, purchased like property. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, she said honestly. You paid a debt in exchange for a wife. Whatever careful words your people used to describe the arrangement, that is what this is. I am not sure kindness in the delivery changes what the delivery actually is. For a long moment, Damien said nothing, and Elena wondered if she had spoken too boldly, if this fragile, unexpected gentleness would finally crack and reveal the ruthless king the entire Northern Territory feared. But when he finally spoke, his voice remained low and steady, carrying no trace of anger toward her at all. "You are not wrong to think that," he said, "and I will not insult you by pretending the arrangement was anything other than what it appears to be on paper. Your father owed a debt my pack was owed rightfully, and the terms of settlement named you as payment. I did not create that situation, but I did not refuse it either, when I could have chosen a different form of payment entirely." He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes, something careful and deliberate, as though he were choosing his next words with great precision. "I have my own reasons for accepting the arrangement as it was offered. Reasons I am not yet ready to explain, because I do not think you would believe me if I tried tonight, after everything you have already endured these past 3 days. But I promise you this, you will not be a prisoner here. You will not be treated as property, whatever the paperwork might say. And when you are ready to hear the truth of why I truly wanted you brought to Shadowfang, I will tell you everything." Elena felt a chill move through her at his words, not from fear exactly, but from the strange certainty in his voice, the way he spoke, as though there were far more to this arrangement than a simple debt between two packs. She thought of the rumors she had heard, of a king who searched every gathering as though looking for someone specific, and a small, uneasy suspicion began forming at the back of her mind, one she was not yet ready to examine too closely. "Reasons," she repeated slowly. "You make it sound as though this was never truly about the debt at all." Something flickered across his face again, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "Rest tonight," he said, instead of answering directly, his voice gentle, but firm enough that she understood the conversation was closing for now. "Tomorrow, I will show you the grounds properly, and we will speak further. Tonight, you have earned nothing but rest and warmth after the day you have had." Before Elena could press him further, the silver-haired woman returned and gestured for Elena to follow her toward the western wing of the hall. Elena hesitated for only a moment, glancing back once toward Damien, who remained standing near the hearth, watching her leave with an expression she could not fully read, somewhere between longing and restraint, as though he were holding himself back from something he desperately wanted to say. She followed the woman down a long stone corridor lined with unlit torches, her mind spinning with everything that had happened since the carriage first arrived, unable to shake the feeling that whatever waited for her in this place was far larger and far stranger than a simple debt ever could have been. Behind her, in the warm light of the great hall, the Alpha King remained still for a long moment, watching the empty doorway where she had disappeared, and if anyone had been close enough to see his face in that instant, they would have seen a man who had waited far longer than anyone around him truly understood, finally allowing himself to breathe. Elena woke before dawn, to the sound of wolves howling somewhere beyond the stone walls, a deep, layered chorus that rose and fell like a tide moving through the mountains. For a moment, disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, she forgot where she was, forgot everything that had happened the day before. Then the weight of it returned, all at once, pressing down on her chest like a stone. She sat up and studied the room around her in the pale gray light seeping through the curtains. It was larger than her entire bedroom back home, furnished simply but well, with a carved wooden wardrobe, a wash basin of pale stone, and a wide window overlooking a section of the valley she had not seen the night before. On the small table beside the bed sat a folded set of clothes that had not been there when she fell asleep, along with a note written in careful, even handwriting. "The pack physician will visit this morning to ensure you suffered no harm during your travels. After that, the king has asked that you join him for a walk through the grounds, if you are willing. There is no obligation. A meal will be brought to your room shortly. Welcome to Shadowfang." The note was signed simply with the initial C, and Elena assumed it belonged to the silver-haired woman who had guided her to this room the night before. She read it twice, searching for hidden meaning in the careful, formal phrasing, and found none beyond simple courtesy. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty had a shape she could brace herself against. This quiet, careful kindness left her with nothing solid to push back on. A short while later, a knock came at her door, and Elena opened it to find an older woman, with kind eyes and gray hair, pulled into a tight braid, carrying a small leather bag. "Good morning," the woman said warmly. "My name is Odette. I look after the health of everyone in this pack, including our guests." "May I come in?" Elena stepped aside to let her enter, still wary despite the woman's gentle demeanor. Odette moved through the examination quickly and professionally, checking Elena's pulse, asking simple questions about her travel, her appetite, her sleep. There was nothing invasive or strange about any of it, and slowly, Elena felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "You seem healthy," Odette said finally, closing her bag. "Travel weary, understandably, but nothing that a good meal and some rest will not fix." She paused at the doorway before leaving, studying Elena with an expression that seemed to carry more weight than the words that followed. "For what it is worth, dear, I have served this pack for over 30 years, through 2 kings before this one. I have never seen our current king behave the way he has these past 3 days, ever since your name was first mentioned in council. Whatever you came here believing, I would encourage you to watch closely before you decide it is true." Before Elena could ask what she meant, Odette was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a breakfast tray she had not noticed arrive. She ate slowly, turning the physician's words over in her mind, along with everything Damien had said the night before, about having his own reasons for accepting the arrangement. A small, persistent voice in the back of her mind kept circling the same unsettling question. If this was never truly about the debt, then what was it about? When she finished eating, she dressed in the simple clothes that had been left for her, practical trousers, and a soft tunic far more comfortable than anything she had packed for the journey, and made her way out into the corridor, uncertain where exactly she was meant to find the king for their walk. She did not have to search long. He was waiting near the entrance of the great hall, dressed much as he had been the night before, and when he saw her approaching, something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening, as though he had been standing there for some time, waiting with more patience than the moment required. "You slept well, I hope," he said. "Well enough," Elena replied honestly, "though I confess I expected to wake somewhere far less comfortable." A faint, almost rueful smile crossed his face. "I imagine the stories you heard about this pack did not include comfortable beds and morning walks." "No," she admitted, "they did not." He gestured toward the open doors leading out into the courtyard, and Elena fell into step beside him as they walked, the morning air cool and sharp against her skin. The pack grounds looked entirely different in daylight than they had the night before, and Elena found herself studying everything with a curiosity she had not expected to feel so soon. Wolves moved through the settlement going about their morning routines, tending gardens, repairing fences, training in wide-open yards. Children ran between buildings, laughing, entirely unbothered by the presence of their king walking past them. "It is not what I expected," Elena admitted quietly. "What did you expect?" "Fear," she said. "Everywhere I have traveled, your name has been spoken with fear. I expected to find a pack built on that same fear. Instead, everyone here seems almost," she searched for the right word, "content." Damien was quiet for a moment, as they walked past a group of young wolves practicing basic combat forms, under the watchful eye of an older instructor. "Fear serves a purpose beyond these walls," he said finally. "It keeps rival packs from testing our borders. It keeps merchants honest in their dealings with us. But fear is a poor foundation for the people who actually live and work within a pack. A king who rules his own people through fear builds nothing that lasts. I learned that lesson early, from watching my father make the opposite mistake." Elena glanced at him, surprised by the openness of the admission. "Your father ruled through fear." "My father ruled through cruelty," Damien said, his voice flattening slightly, the only sign of the difficulty of the subject. "He believed strength and cruelty were the same thing. I spent much of my early years believing it too, until I took the throne myself and discovered how much stronger a pack becomes when its people trust their leader instead of merely obeying him out of terror." They walked in silence for a while after that, past the training grounds, and toward a quieter section of the settlement, where a small orchard grew along a gentle slope, heavy with early fruit. Elena found herself relaxing slightly in his presence, despite everything, though a persistent wariness remained coiled beneath the surface, refusing to fully release its grip. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, as they walked beneath the orchard trees. "Of course. Last night, you said you had your own reasons for accepting this arrangement. Reasons beyond the debt. She watched his face carefully as she spoke. I would like to know what they are. Damien stopped walking, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes, weighing, deciding. I told you I would explain when you were ready to hear it, he said slowly. I do not think either of us is ready yet. Not because I am unwilling to tell you, but because what I would need to tell you requires trust that has not yet had time to grow between us. If I explain it too soon, I fear you will hear only more evidence that you have been manipulated, rather than the truth I actually mean to share. Frustration flickered through her, sharp and immediate. You cannot simply tell me there is a secret and then refuse to share it. That is not fair. No, he agreed, it is not. But I would rather be unfair, for a short while longer, than risk destroying whatever small trust we have managed to build in a single day, by rushing toward a truth you are not yet prepared to hear kindly. He held her gaze steadily. I promise you, Elena, it is not a truth meant to harm you, quite the opposite. But some things need proper time and proper ground before they can be spoken honestly, without fear twisting how they land. Elena studied him for a long moment, torn between frustration and a strange, reluctant respect for his honesty about his own dishonesty, if such a thing could even be called honest. There was something almost disarming about a man willing to admit he was withholding something, rather than simply lying and hoping she would never notice. Fine, she said finally. I will wait, but do not expect my patience to last forever. Something like relief passed across his face, quickly followed by the faint ghost of a smile. I would expect nothing less. They continued their walk through the orchard, and slowly, the conversation shifted toward easier topics. The history of the settlement, the different plants growing along the slope, small details about pack life that gave Elena a clearer picture of the place she now found herself living in. Despite her lingering wariness, she found herself asking questions freely, genuinely curious about this strange, contradictory man who ruled his pack with careful restraint rather than the cruelty his reputation suggested. As the sun rose higher and the morning grew warmer, they eventually made their way back toward the great hall, where Damien excused himself to attend to matters of pack business, leaving Elena to explore the grounds further on her own. She spent the remainder of the morning wandering slowly through the settlement, gradually growing more comfortable with her surroundings, though the weight of unanswered questions never fully left her mind. It was near midday when she encountered the first true sign of tension since her arrival. She had wandered toward the training grounds again, drawn by the sound of clashing weapons, when a tall, broad-shouldered man approached her directly, his expression cold and assessing in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. You are the payment, he said, without any pretense of politeness, his voice carrying just enough volume that several nearby wolves paused their training to listen. The debt bride. My name is Elena, she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. I know your name, the man said, stepping closer, close enough that Elena had to resist the urge to step back. I simply find it interesting that our king has spent 3 days rearranging pack business, breaking long-standing protocol, and personally overseeing your delivery here, all for a woman who arrived as payment for her father's debt. It makes a person wonder what exactly makes you so valuable. Perhaps you should ask the king that question directly, Elena said, refusing to let the challenge in his voice unsettle her outwardly, even as her heart pounded harder beneath her calm expression. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, something calculating moving behind them. Perhaps I will. He studied her for one more long moment before finally stepping back, offering a shallow, mocking bow. Welcome to Shadowfang, debt bride. I am sure your stay here will prove very illuminating for all of us. He walked away without waiting for a response, and Elena remained standing near the training grounds, her hands trembling slightly with adrenaline she had not fully released. A young wolf, who had been watching the exchange from a short distance, approached her cautiously, glancing toward the direction the man had gone before speaking. That was Callum, the young wolf said quietly, the king's second in command. He does not trust easily, and he trusts outsiders even less. I would not take his words to heart. Why does he dislike me so quickly? He does not even know me. The young wolf hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It is not really about you, I think. Callum has served the king since before he took the throne. He is protective, sometimes too protective. Something about your arrival has unsettled him, though I could not tell you exactly what." She offered a small, apologetic smile. "Give it time. Most people here find their footing eventually." Elena thanked her and continued on her way, though Callum's words lingered uncomfortably in her mind for the rest of the day, adding new weight to the growing suspicion that her arrival at Shadowfang carried far more significance than a simple debt could explain. Whatever secret Damien was holding, it seemed she was not the only one who sensed there was more happening beneath the surface than anyone had yet admitted aloud. That evening, as the sun began to set and the pack gathered for the evening meal in the great hall, Elena found herself seated near Damien, at the head table, aware of the many curious eyes watching the arrangement with open interest. Throughout the meal, she caught Callum's gaze more than once, cold and calculating from across the hall, and she understood, with growing certainty, that her time at Shadowfang would not be as simple or as peaceful as the quiet morning walk had suggested. The meal itself passed with more warmth than she expected. Wolves from every corner of the hall approached the head table throughout the evening, offering brief, respectful greetings to their king, before turning curious but not unkind attention toward Elena. A young mother introduced her small daughter, who stared up at Elena with wide, unblinking eyes before asking, with the blunt honesty only children possess, whether she was truly going to become their new Luna. Elena had no honest answer to give, so she simply smiled and said that time would tell, and the girl seemed satisfied enough with that. Near the end of the meal, Odette approached the table as well, settling into the seat beside Elena, with the easy familiarity of someone who had earned the right to sit anywhere she pleased within these walls. "You handled Callum well today," the older woman said quietly, glancing briefly toward Damien, who was occupied in conversation with one of his commanders further down the table. "Word travels quickly in a pack this size." "He does not seem to like me very much," Elena admitted. "Callum does not like change," Odette corrected gently. "And you, my dear, represent a great deal of change, whether you intend to or not. Give him time. He is fiercely loyal to the king, sometimes to a fault, and loyalty like that does not always know how to make room for something new." Elena considered the words carefully, watching Damien across the table as he laughed quietly at something one of his commanders had said, the expression transforming his face into something younger, less burdened than the careful composure he wore during their walk that morning. She found herself wondering, not for the first time that day, what exactly made her presence here so significant that it could unsettle a man as steady and loyal as Callum appeared to be. As the evening wound down and the great hall slowly emptied, Damien walked with her once more toward the western wing, their pace unhurried, the silence between them comfortable in a way it had not been the night before. At the door to her chambers, he paused, studying her face for a long moment in the dim torchlight. "Thank you for today," he said quietly. "I know none of this is simple for you. I am grateful for your patience, even the patience I have not yet earned." "I am still deciding whether patience is the right word for it," Elena replied honestly, though there was no real edge to her voice. "Curiosity might be closer to the truth." A faint smile touched his lips. "I will take curiosity. It is a fair place to begin." He inclined his head slightly and turned to leave, and Elena watched him go, her mind still turning over everything Odette and Callum had both said in their own very different ways. Whatever secret waited behind Damien's careful restraint, she was beginning to understand that it was large enough to unsettle an entire pack, and she could not decide whether that realization frightened her or pulled her closer toward wanting to know the truth. Either way, sleep came slowly that night, her thoughts circling the same unanswered question long after the torches in the corridor outside had burned down to embers. 3 days after her arrival, Elena woke to the sound of shouting in the courtyard below her window, urgent voices calling orders back and forth, the unmistakable clatter of weapons being gathered in haste. She rose quickly, pulling on the nearest clothes she could find, and hurried to the window to see what had disturbed the early morning calm. Below, a dozen wolves moved with tense, practiced speed, forming into groups near the main gate, while Callum barked instructions from the center of the chaos. Elena's stomach tightened with unease. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to pull the entire pack into motion before the sun had fully risen. She made her way down to the courtyard as quickly as she could, weaving through the organized chaos, until she spotted Odette standing near the edge of the commotion, watching with a grim expression that did nothing to ease Elena's growing worry. "What has happened?" Elena asked. Odette turned to her, and something careful passed across her features before she answered. A scouting patrol near the eastern border was attacked before dawn. 2 of our wolves were injured. The attackers wore no colors, no marks, but Callum believes it was a testing move, an attempt to see how quickly we would respond and how strong our patrols truly are. Testing move from whom? Odette hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena felt a cold certainty settle into her chest, even before the words were spoken. There are only a handful of packs bold enough to test Shadowfang's borders directly. Given the timing, given everything that has happened these past 3 days, it would not surprise me if this had something to do with your arrival here. Elena's breath caught. My father would not attack you. He has nothing to gain from provoking a pack he already owes a debt to. Perhaps not your father directly, Odette said carefully, but debts and arrangements like the one that brought you here rarely stay contained to the 2 parties involved. Other packs watch these things closely. Alliances shift. Old rivals see opportunity in new arrangements, especially ones that appear to weaken or strengthen a pack's position as significantly as this one has. Before Elena could ask anything further, Damien emerged from the main hall, already dressed for combat, his expression sharp and focused in a way she had not seen from him before. Whatever gentleness had defined their walk through the orchard 2 days earlier was entirely absent now, replaced by the hard, commanding presence of a king preparing to defend his territory. He crossed the courtyard quickly, speaking in low, rapid tones with Callum, before his gaze finally found Elena standing near the edge of the gathered wolves. Something flickered across his face. Concern layered beneath the focus of the moment, and he broke away from Callum to approach her directly. You should return inside, he said. This is not something you need to witness. What happened at the border? A skirmish, he said, his jaw tight. Nothing our patrols could not handle, though 2 of our people were injured badly enough to need Odette's attention. I am taking a group east to investigate further. I need to understand who was responsible before this becomes something larger than a single testing move. Do you believe it has something to do with me? Elena asked directly, refusing to let him soften the question the way he clearly wanted to. Damien's expression tightened further, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer honestly. Instead, he exhaled slowly and met her gaze without flinching. I do not yet know for certain. But I would be lying if I told you the timing did not concern me. Your arrival here was not a small matter, Elena. Word of it has traveled far beyond our own borders already, faster and further than a simple debt settlement typically would. That alone tells me there are eyes watching this arrangement far more closely than I anticipated. A chill moved through her, settling deep in her stomach. Because of whatever secret reason you brought me here. Something shifted behind his eyes, weighing, deciding, and for a brief moment, Elena thought he might finally give her the answer she had been waiting 3 days to hear. But the moment passed as Callum called his name from across the courtyard, voice urgent, and Damien's attention snapped back toward the gathered wolves preparing to depart. I have to go, he said. We will speak more when I return. I promise you that, Elena. Please, stay within the walls until I am back. I cannot properly focus on what needs doing if I am also worrying for your safety here. Before she could respond, he turned and strode toward the waiting group, mounting a dark horse near the gate and leading his wolves out into the early morning light without a backward glance. Elena watched them disappear over the ridge, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and frustration she could not fully untangle, knowing that whatever secret Damien was protecting had just become far more dangerous than a simple matter of trust between 2 people slowly growing closer. The day passed slowly and tensely within the walls of the settlement. Elena tried to occupy herself with small tasks, helping Odette organize supplies in the healing quarters, sitting with the injured wolves who had been brought back from the border skirmish, listening to their quiet, worried conversations about what the attack might mean. Every hour that passed without word from the eastern border tightened the knot of anxiety in her chest further, and by late afternoon, she found herself pacing the length of the courtyard, unable to settle into anything productive. It was during one of these restless walks that she encountered Callum again, standing near the main gate, watching the eastern ridge with the same tense focus he had shown that morning. He had remained behind, Elena realized, likely to oversee the settlement's defenses while Damien led the investigation party. Any word? She asked, approaching him despite the coldness that had defined their previous interaction. Callum glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment, before he finally answered. Nothing yet. It is still early. These things take time to investigate properly. Elena studied him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept returning to the eastern ridge even as he spoke to her. Whatever his feelings toward her arrival, it was clear that his concern for Damien's safety was genuine and deeply felt. "You have served him a long time," she said quietly. "Since before he took the throne," Callum confirmed, his voice softening slightly, the hostility from their first meeting noticeably absent. "I watched him grow into the king he is now. I watched what it cost him to become that king, the battles he fought, the losses he endured along the way." He paused, his gaze finally shifting to meet hers directly. "I was harsh with you when you first arrived. I will not pretend otherwise. But it was not truly about you. Not entirely. It was about protecting him from anything that might threaten what he has built here. And you believe I am a threat?" Callum considered the question carefully before answering. "I believed it was possible. I am not certain anymore." He hesitated, something conflicted crossing his features. "There is something I think you deserve to know, though it is not truly my place to tell you. The king has been searching for someone for a very long time, Elena. Longer than I have known him to search for anything else in his life. I do not know the full details of who or what he was looking for, only that it consumed him in quiet ways for years, ways he rarely spoke of openly." Elena's heart began to pound harder. "And you believe that search has something to do with me?" "I do not know for certain," Callum admitted, "but I have never seen him behave the way he has these past few days, not in all the years I have served him. Whatever you are to him, Elena, I do not believe it is simply about a debt any longer, if it ever truly was." Before Elena could press him further, a shout rose from the eastern watchtower, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound. A rider was approaching fast along the ridge, and as the figure drew closer, Elena recognized the dark horse and the familiar shape of the man riding it. Damien had returned. Callum moved quickly toward the gate, and Elena followed close behind, her heart still racing from both the earlier conversation and the tension of the moment. Damien rode through the gate at speed, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped, his expression grim but controlled. "Report," Callum said immediately. "The attackers were mercenaries," Damien said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Hired, not affiliated with any pack directly, which makes tracing the source considerably more difficult, but one of them survived long enough to be questioned before he succumbed to his injuries. He confirmed what I suspected. Someone paid for this attack specifically to test our eastern defenses, and specifically, in the days following Elena's arrival here." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Someone wants to know if your pack is vulnerable because of me." "It appears that way," Damien confirmed, his gaze finding hers across the courtyard, something apologetic and heavy in his expression. "I need to speak with you privately. There are things I should have told you already. Things I have delayed telling you for reasons that no longer feel adequate given what has happened today." He dismissed the gathered wolves with a few quiet instructions to Callum, before leading Elena toward a private study near the rear of the great hall, away from the curious ears of the rest of the pack. Once inside, he closed the door behind them and stood for a long moment in silence, as though gathering the courage to finally speak the truth he had withheld for 3 days. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the small hearth. Elena did, watching him carefully as he remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the fire, his expression torn between determination and something that looked almost like fear. "6 years ago," he began slowly, "I attended a gathering of packs in the Southern Territories, a large council meeting that drew representatives from nearly every pack in the region. I was young then, only recently having taken the throne, and I attended more out of obligation than genuine interest. During that gathering, on the final evening, I encountered someone I had never met before, only briefly, in a crowded hall during a moment of chaos, when the gathering was interrupted by an unexpected storm." Elena listened, something uneasy stirring in her chest, as she began to sense where this story was heading. "I do not remember every detail of that night as clearly as I wish I did," Damien continued. "It happened quickly, in the confusion of the storm, and I never learned her name before she disappeared into the crowd. But I remember the moment our hands touched, as we both reached for the same fallen lantern in the darkness. I remember it clearly, because in that single instant, I felt something I had never felt before in my life, A recognition so powerful, it nearly brought me to my knees in the middle of a crowded hall.
The mate bond, Elena whispered, the words leaving her before she fully understood why.
Damien stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Yes," he said quietly. "I searched for her afterward. For hours that night, and for years after. I never learned her name. I never saw her face clearly enough in the darkness to be certain I would recognize her again. All I had was the memory of that single touch, and a certainty in my bones that I would know her the moment I found her again, whatever form that recognition might take." Elena's mind raced, pieces beginning to assemble themselves into a shape she was not yet ready to fully accept. "Damien, what are you telling me?" "The moment you stepped out of that carriage 3 nights ago," he said, his voice low and unsteady, in a way she had never heard from him before. "The moment I saw your face in the torchlight, I knew. Elena, I have been searching for you for 6 years, and the debt your father owed my pack was simply the excuse I needed to finally bring you here. Once I learned enough about your family's circumstances to be certain it was you." The room seemed to tilt around her, the fire crackling too loud in the sudden silence. "You knew," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew who I was before the debt was ever mentioned. You arranged all of this." "I did not create the debt," Damien said quickly, stepping closer. "Your father's debt to this pack was real, accumulated over years of poor trade decisions and unpaid loans, long before I ever learned your identity. But when I discovered who you were, I confess I did not simply let the situation resolve on its own terms. I made certain the settlement negotiations concluded in a way that would bring you here, to me, rather than allowing the debt to be paid through some other arrangement entirely." Elena stood abruptly, her thoughts spinning too fast to properly organize into words. So this was never truly about a debt at all. This was you, orchestrating an entire arrangement, manipulating my father's circumstances, all so you could claim a bond I never even knew existed. "I did not manipulate your father's circumstances," Damien said, his voice tight with the effort of remaining calm. "The debt was his own doing entirely. I only ensured the resolution of that debt led you here, to me, rather than to some other outcome that might have kept us apart forever. I understand how that must sound to you now, hearing it for the first time. But I could not simply let you go, Elena, not once I understood who you truly were to me." "You could have told me the truth from the very beginning," she said, her voice rising with a mixture of anger and something else she could not fully name, something that felt dangerously close to betrayal. "Instead, you let me believe I was nothing more than payment for a debt, while you knew this entire time that there was something far larger happening beneath the surface." "I was afraid," Damien admitted, and the honesty in his voice cut through some of her anger, though not all of it. "Afraid that if I told you everything too soon, before you had any reason to trust me, you would hear only manipulation and control in every word, exactly as you are hearing now. I wanted you to have time to see who I truly am, beyond the bond, before I asked you to accept something as overwhelming as fate itself, choosing your future for you." Elena stared at him, torn between the anger still burning in her chest and the raw vulnerability evident in his expression. A king who had clearly spent years carrying this weight alone, uncertain if the woman he searched for would ever be found, let alone whether she would want anything to do with him once she was. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less firm. "This is too much to simply accept in a single conversation." "I understand," Damien said, though the disappointment in his voice was clear despite his effort to hide it. "Take whatever time you need, Elena. I will not push you toward accepting something you are not ready to accept. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove, through actions rather than words alone, that whatever began between us was never meant to be a cage." Elena left the study without another word, her mind reeling with everything she had just learned. The careful walls of trust she had begun building over the past 3 days, now cracked wide open by a truth far larger and far more complicated than she had ever imagined. As she made her way back toward her chambers, she could not decide which feeling burned brighter within her, the anger at having been deceived, or the strange, unsettling recognition of something deep and undeniable, stirring within her own chest, something that felt disturbingly close to the same bond Damien had just described. She did not go directly to her room. Instead, She found herself wandering out through a side door into the quiet garden behind the great hall, needing open air and distance from stone walls that suddenly felt far too close around her. The evening had turned cool, the first stars beginning to appear above the mountain peaks, and Elena sat on a low bench beneath a wide oak tree, pulling her knees up to her chest as she tried to make sense of everything. 6 years, she thought. He had carried this for 6 years, searching gatherings and council meetings for a woman whose face he could barely remember, holding on to nothing but a single moment of touch in a dark and crowded hall. It should have felt romantic, she supposed, the kind of story told in old songs about fate finding its way through impossible odds. Instead, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her without warning, replacing the version of events she had believed with something far stranger and far more binding. She thought of her own reaction the night she arrived, the warmth that had spread through her the moment their hands touched in the torchlit courtyard, a sensation she had dismissed at the time as simple nerves, relief, the strange emotional exhaustion of a day she had dreaded for weeks. Now, sitting alone in the darkening garden, she wondered if it had been something else entirely, some quiet echo of the same bond Damien had described, one she had felt without understanding what it truly meant. The thought unsettled her more than anything else that evening. If some part of her had already recognized him, however faintly, however unconsciously, then how much of her anger was truly about the deception, and how much was about the fear of accepting something so far beyond her own control? Odette found her there some time later, approaching quietly and settling onto the bench beside her without asking permission, the same easy familiarity she had shown from their very first meeting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the older woman simply allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them. "He told you," Odette said finally, not quite a question. "You knew," Elena said, though there was no real accusation in her voice, only weary acceptance that it seemed everyone in this pack had known more than she had. "I suspected," Odette corrected gently. "I have tended to this king since he was a young wolf barely out of his training years. I know the particular kind of restlessness that settles into a person carrying an unfinished bond. I saw it in him for years, a quiet searching that never fully left his eyes, no matter how well he hid it from everyone else. When your name first came before the council, and I watched the change that moved through him upon hearing it, I understood well enough what was happening, even before he confirmed it himself. Why did none of you simply tell me?" "It was not our truth to tell," Odette said simply. "Some things a person must hear from the one who holds them, not from those standing nearby." She turned to study Elena more closely, her expression softening. "How do you feel, now that you know?" Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "Angry," she admitted. "Deceived, even if I understand his reasons somewhat. But also," she hesitated, searching for words honest enough to satisfy the quiet weight settling in her chest. "Uncertain. Some part of me wonders if I felt it too, that first night, and simply did not know what I was feeling." Odette smiled faintly, a knowing warmth in the expression that suggested she had expected exactly this answer. "The bond does not ask permission before it takes root, dear. It simply arrives, whether we are ready for it or not. What you choose to do with it afterward, that remains entirely your own decision, whatever fate might have already decided on its own terms." She rose from the bench slowly, resting a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder before turning to leave. "Take your time. Whatever choice you make certain it is truly your own, and not simply a reaction to the shock of tonight." Elena remained in the garden long after Odette had gone, watching the stars grow brighter above the mountains, her thoughts circling slowly toward something that felt less like anger now, and more like the beginning of a very difficult, very necessary decision, one she knew would shape the rest of her life, no matter which direction she finally chose to take it. Elena avoided Damien for the better part of 2 days after their conversation in the study, retreating into the small routines she had begun building for herself within the settlement. She spent her mornings with Odette in the healing quarters, learning the names of herbs and remedies she had never encountered in her own pack's simpler traditions. She spent her afternoons walking the orchard alone, turning the weight of everything she had learned over and over in her mind, searching for some clarity that refused to arrive no matter how long she sat with the question. Damien, for his part, kept a careful distance, exactly as he had promised. She caught glimpses of him occasionally across the courtyard, deep in conversation with Callum or other pack members, and though his eyes found hers more often than seemed entirely accidental, he made no attempt to press her for the conversation she was not yet ready to have. It was Callum who finally broke the careful silence between them, approaching Elena on the third morning as she sat near the orchard's edge, watching the early sunlight filter through the leaves above her. "May I sit?" he asked, and something in his tone had shifted noticeably from the coldness of their first meeting. Elena nodded, and Callum settled onto the grass a short distance away, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded for the first time since she had known him. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I treated you when you first arrived. I judged you before I understood the true shape of things, and that was unfair of me." "You did not know the truth," Elena said. "None of us did, except Damien himself." "Even so," Callum said, "I have watched him carry this search for years, watched it wear at him in quiet ways even he did not fully acknowledge. When you finally arrived, and I saw the change in him, I should have understood what it meant far sooner than I did. Instead, I saw only an outsider, disrupting the careful order I have spent years helping him build." He paused, studying her carefully. "I understand now why he did not tell you sooner. I understand why you are angry that he did not. Both of those things can be true at once." Elena considered his words for a long moment. "Do you believe I should trust him?" Callum did not answer immediately, weighing the question with obvious care. "I believe he has never lied to protect himself at your expense," he said finally. "Everything he withheld because he feared losing you before he ever truly had the chance to know you. That is not the same as deception meant to control or harm. But I also understand that the difference may feel very thin to you right now, and only you can decide how much that difference matters." It was, Elena thought, a fairer answer than she had expected, and she found herself grateful for the honesty of it, even if it offered no easy resolution to the uncertainty still churning within her. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth, rather than simply telling me what you think I want to hear." Callum offered a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since her arrival. "I find that honesty tends to serve people better in the long run, even when it is uncomfortable in the moment." He rose from the grass, brushing off his trousers before adding, almost as an afterthought, "For what it is worth, Elena, the pack has already begun to speak well of you. That is not something easily earned here, and it did not happen simply because of who you might become to the king. It happened because of how you have carried yourself these past few days." He left her alone with that thought, and Elena remained in the orchard for a long while afterward, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly, some small piece of the wariness she had carried since her arrival beginning, cautiously, to ease. That evening, as the pack gathered for the communal meal, Elena found herself seated once again near the head table, though this time, the silence between her and Damien felt less strained than it had over the previous 2 days. Partway through the meal, a commotion arose near the main doors of the hall, voices raised in urgent conversation, and Elena watched as a travel-weary messenger was quickly ushered toward the head table, clearly bearing news that could not wait. Damien rose immediately, meeting the messenger halfway across the hall, and Elena watched his expression darken as he read the sealed letter the messenger produced. Whatever the message contained, it was serious enough that the entire hall fell into an uneasy hush, sensing the shift in their king's demeanor. "What is it?" Elena asked quietly, as Damien returned to the table, the letter still clutched in his hand. He hesitated only a moment before answering, clearly deciding that whatever trust remained between them was worth protecting through continued honesty. "A message from your former pack," he said. "Your father requests an audience. He claims there is a matter of urgent importance that cannot be discussed through written correspondence alone." Elena's stomach tightened. What could he possibly want now? "The debt has been settled. I am here, exactly as the arrangement required." "I do not know," Damien admitted, "but given everything that has happened this past week, the attack on our eastern border, the sudden and unusual interest other packs have shown in your arrival here, I confess I am inclined to treat this request with considerable caution." Callum, who had been listening from further down the table, leaned forward, with open suspicion evident on his face. "It could be nothing more than a father seeking to check on his daughter's welfare," he said. "Or it could be an attempt to gain further leverage, now that he understands the true value of what he traded away." The word leverage settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, and she found herself nodding slowly, the same suspicion already forming in her own mind, even before Callum voiced it aloud. Her father had shown, quite clearly, that he was willing to make difficult choices when his pack's survival was at stake. If he had somehow learned the truth of the mate bond, learned that his daughter was not simply a debt payment, but something far more valuable to the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, there was no telling what further advantage he might attempt to extract from that knowledge. "I want to be present for whatever audience you grant him," Elena said firmly. "Whatever he wants, I have a right to hear it directly, rather than having decisions made about my life without my knowledge, exactly as they were before." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like respect moving behind his eyes at the firmness of her request. "Of course," he said. "I would not have arranged it any other way. Whatever this audience reveals, you deserve to hear it firsthand." The audience was arranged for 2 days later, giving Damien's scouts time to gather what information they could about the current state of Elena's former pack, and the circumstances that might have prompted such an urgent request. In the meantime, tension settled over the settlement like a heavy fog, everyone sensing that whatever calm had begun to establish itself over the past week was about to be tested in some new and uncertain way. On the morning of the audience, Elena dressed carefully in clothing Odette had helped select, something that conveyed dignity and strength rather than the vulnerability she still carried from her final days in her father's house. She stood beside Damien in the great hall as her father's carriage arrived, flanked by only a small escort, far smaller than the full envoy that had originally delivered her to Shadowfang. When her father entered the hall, Elena barely recognized the man before her. He looked older than she remembered, worn down by something beyond simple travel weariness, and when his eyes found hers across the hall, she saw an expression that startled her with its complexity, guilt layered beneath something that looked almost like desperate hope. "Elena," he said, his voice unsteady. "You look well." "What do you want, father?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, despite the strange mixture of emotions stirring within her at the sight of him. Her father glanced briefly toward Damien before returning his attention to Elena, and when he finally spoke, his words confirmed every suspicion that had been building within the settlement over the past 2 days. "There has been a development," he said carefully, "regarding an alliance I have been approached about. An alliance that could restore our pack's strength considerably, if certain conditions are met." He hesitated, and Elena watched the guilt in his expression deepen. "The pack proposing this alliance has expressed interest in your continued connection to Shadowfang. They believe that connection, properly leveraged, could provide significant advantage in negotiations they are currently pursuing with several rival territories." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, confirming everything she had feared since the messenger first arrived 2 days earlier. "You want to use me again," she said flatly. "Just as you did before, when you sold me to settle your debt. Now you wish to use the very arrangement that debt created, to extract further advantage for yourself." "It is not so simple as that," her father said quickly, though the defensiveness in his voice suggested he understood exactly how it appeared. "This alliance could secure our pack's future for generations. I am not asking you to leave Shadowfang, only to allow certain communications, certain assurances, that might strengthen the alliance's confidence in our pack's standing." Beside her, Elena felt Damien's presence shift, tension coiling through him though his expression remained carefully controlled. "And which pack," he asked, his voice deceptively calm, "is proposing this particular alliance?" Her father hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena understood that whatever answer he was about to give would not be a comfortable one. "The Ironclaw pack," he said finally, "led by Victor Lang." The name landed in the hall like a physical blow, and Elena watched Damien's expression harden into something she had not seen from him before, a controlled fury that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several degrees. Even Callum, standing near the edge of the gathering, straightened sharply at the mention of the name. "Victor Lang," Damien repeated slowly, "has been attempting to expand his territory through manipulation and forced alliances for over a decade. He is precisely the kind of pack leader who would see an opportunity in exactly this arrangement, using a father's desperation to gain leverage over a rival he has never been strong enough to challenge directly." He turned to face Elena's father fully, his voice carrying a warning edge that made the older man visibly flinch. "Whatever assurances Victor Lang has promised you, I would advise extreme caution before trusting them. Men like him rarely honor agreements once they have extracted what they need from them. Elena's father's composure cracked slightly beneath the weight of Damien's words, and for a moment, Elena saw the same desperate, cornered expression she remembered from the night he first told her about the debt arrangement. "I do not know what else to do," he admitted quietly. "Our pack's resources have not recovered from the debt settlement. Without some form of new alliance, I fear we will not survive the coming winter." Elena felt something complicated stir within her, anger still present but softened now by a reluctant, unwanted sympathy for the desperation, clearly driving her father's choices. Whatever mistakes he had made, however deeply they had wounded her, she could see clearly that he was not acting from cruelty, but from a genuine, if misguided, fear for the survival of everyone depending on him. "I will not be used as a bargaining tool again," she said firmly, meeting her father's gaze directly. "Not for you, and not for a man like Victor Lang, whose intentions clearly extend far beyond simple alliance." She paused, softening only slightly. "But I do not wish to see our pack suffer either, father. If there is a way to help that does not require using me as leverage, I will consider it. That is the only offer I am willing to make." Her father studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, and finally he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said quietly. "I am sorry, Elena, for all of it." The audience concluded shortly afterward, her father departing with far less certainty than he had arrived with, and as his carriage disappeared beyond the gates, Elena felt the full weight of the danger now surrounding her settle heavily onto her shoulders. Victor Lang's interest in the situation meant that whatever threat had attacked their eastern border days earlier was likely only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game, one that would require every ounce of strength she and Damien could gather between them if they hoped to navigate it safely. Once the hall had emptied, and only Damien, Callum, and Elena remained, Damien turned to his second-in-command with a hard, focused expression. "Double the eastern patrols immediately. I want scouts watching every approach to our territory, and I want word sent quietly to our allies in the northern packs, informing them of Victor Lang's movements. If he intends to use Elena's father as a pawn in some larger scheme against us, I want to understand the full shape of that scheme before he has the chance to act on it." Callum nodded sharply and left to carry out the orders, and for a moment, Elena and Damien stood alone in the quiet hall, the weight of everything that had just unfolded settling heavily between them. "You do not have to protect me from this," Elena said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction to make the words entirely believable. "This is my father's mistake, not something you inherited by bringing me here." "You are wrong," Damien said quietly, turning to face her fully. "The moment you arrived at Shadowfang, your safety became my responsibility, bond or no bond. But even setting that aside, I would not stand by and allow a man like Victor Lang to use you as a tool in his ambitions, not when I have spent 6 years searching for the chance to finally protect you properly." Something in his voice, steady and certain despite the danger now gathering around them, eased a small portion of the fear coiled in Elena's chest. "What do you think he truly wants, beyond the alliance he has offered my father?" Damien's expression darkened further. "Territory, most likely, and influence beyond what he currently holds. Victor Lang has coveted a stronger foothold in the northern regions for years, and Shadowfang has always stood as the primary obstacle to that ambition. If he believes he can weaken us by exploiting the circumstances of your arrival here, by turning your father's desperation into a wedge between our two packs, he will not hesitate to try. And if my father refuses his alliance, then Victor Lang will likely seek other means of achieving the same goal," Damien said grimly. "Men like him rarely accept refusal gracefully, especially when they have already invested resources into pursuing an opportunity. I do not say this to frighten you further, Elena, only because I believe you deserve to understand the full truth of the danger now surrounding us, rather than being shielded from it as your father so often shielded you from the truth of his own decisions." Elena appreciated the honesty, even as it settled uneasily in her chest. "Then we face it together," she said, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever Victor Lang intends, I would rather understand it clearly and prepare for it than be left in the dark again, waiting for someone else to decide what I am allowed to know." Something warm and grateful passed across Damien's expression at her words, though the tension of the situation kept it from fully blooming into a smile. "Together then," he agreed quietly. I promise you, Elena, whatever comes from this, I will not let harm reach you while there is breath left in me to prevent it. The words carried a weight that went beyond simple protection, and Elena found herself studying him carefully, aware that whatever remained unresolved between them regarding the bond and the deception surrounding her arrival, a new kind of alliance was beginning to form between them regardless, forged not by fate or debt, but by the shared understanding that they now faced a genuine threat neither of them could afford to underestimate. The days following her father's visit brought a new rhythm to the settlement, one shaped by quiet vigilance rather than open fear. Patrols moved through the territory with greater frequency, and Elena noticed the subtle shift in how the pack carried itself, a readiness that had not been present during her first days at Shadowfang. She found herself drawn more often into conversations with Damien, no longer solely about the bond between them, but about strategy, about the movements of rival packs, about the delicate balance of power across the northern territories that she had never fully understood while living within the smaller, more sheltered world of her own pack. It was during one of these conversations, held over a simple evening meal in Damien's private study, that Elena realized how much her perspective on him had shifted since that first tense night in the courtyard. He spoke to her not as someone to be managed or protected from difficult truths, but as an equal, someone whose opinion he genuinely valued when weighing decisions that affected the entire pack. You disagree with Callum's assessment, Damien observed, watching her expression carefully as she studied the rough map spread across his desk, marked with the positions of known patrols and suspected enemy movements. I think Callum assumes Victor Lang will act boldly, directly, Elena said slowly, tracing a finger along the eastern border. But everything I have heard about him suggests patience, not boldness. He tested your defenses once, and found them stronger than expected. I do not think he will risk another direct confrontation so soon. I think he will look for a different angle entirely, something quieter. Damien studied the map with renewed attention, clearly weighing her words seriously, rather than dismissing them as the untrained opinion of an outsider. What kind of angle? My father, Elena said. Whatever alliance Victor Lang offered him, I do not believe he has abandoned that approach simply because my father hesitated during our audience. If I were in his position, I would continue pressuring my father quietly, offering more generous terms, playing on his fear for the pack's survival, until eventually, he found some way to make the arrangement seem unavoidable. You believe your father will eventually agree? Elena considered the question honestly, thinking of the desperate, cornered look she had seen in her father's eyes during the audience. I believe he wants to refuse, she said finally. But I am not certain his resolve will hold if Victor Lang applies enough pressure, especially if that pressure comes wrapped in promises of security for the rest of our pack. My father has already shown he is willing to sacrifice what he values most, when he believes the survival of everyone else depends on it. Damien's expression grew thoughtful, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. Then perhaps the solution lies in removing that pressure entirely, he said. If your father's pack no longer faces the same desperate circumstances, Victor Lang loses his primary leverage. You mean help them, Elena said, surprised by the suggestion. After everything, you would still offer my father's pack assistance? Not for your father's sake, Damien clarified, his gaze steady on hers. For yours. And because a weakened, desperate pack, sitting along a contested border, creates instability that eventually threatens everyone nearby, including us. There is practical wisdom in the offer, beyond simple kindness, though I will admit, the kindness is not entirely absent from my reasoning either. Elena studied him for a long moment, something warm stirring in her chest at the careful, considered way he approached even a situation that could easily have justified simple indifference toward her father's struggles. Thank you, she said quietly, for considering it, even after everything. You do not need to thank me, Damien said, his voice softening. I meant what I said before, Elena. I am not interested in punishing you for your father's choices, and I am not interested in watching people suffer needlessly when there is a reasonable path to prevent it. The conversation shifted after that, moving toward lighter subjects as the evening wore on, and Elena found herself lingering longer than she had intended, comfortable in a way that would have seemed impossible during her first days at Shadowfang. When she finally rose to return to her own chambers, Damien walked with her, as had become their quiet habit, and at her door, he paused, studying her face in the dim torchlight, with an expression she was beginning to recognize as something deeper than simple concern. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "Do you regret coming here?" His voice was quiet, careful, as though he were bracing himself for an answer he feared might wound him. Elena considered the question honestly, surprised by how genuinely complicated her answer felt now, compared to how simply she would have answered it a week earlier. "I regret how I arrived," she said slowly. "I regret that my father made a choice for me, rather than allowing me to make it myself. But I do not think I regret being here. Not anymore. Not entirely." Something eased visibly in Damien's expression. Relief mixed with a hope he seemed determined not to let overwhelm the careful restraint he had shown since revealing the truth of the bond. "That is more than I expected to hear," he admitted, "and more than I deserve, perhaps, given how this all began." "Perhaps," Elena agreed, a faint smile touching her lips, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "But I am learning that how something begins does not always determine how it continues." They stood together in the quiet corridor for a long moment, neither quite ready to end the conversation, and Elena felt the same warmth she had experienced that first night in the courtyard, stronger now, harder to dismiss as simple nerves or exhaustion. Whatever the bond truly was, whatever it meant for her future, she could no longer deny that something real and undeniable existed between them, growing steadily despite every reasonable caution she had tried to maintain. Finally, Damien stepped back, offering a small, respectful bow before turning to leave. "Good night, Elena," he said. "Thank you. For tonight. And for your honesty." "Good night, Damien," she replied, and watched him disappear down the corridor, before finally retreating into her own chambers, her thoughts far too full for immediate sleep. The next several days passed with a similar rhythm, each conversation with Damien, deepening the fragile trust growing between them, though Elena remained cautious about moving too quickly, wary of allowing the pull of the bond to overwhelm her own judgment, before she had fully reconciled with everything that had brought her to Shadowfang in the first place. Still, she found herself looking forward to their evening conversations more than she was willing to fully admit, even to herself. It was nearly a week after her father's visit, when the first sign of real trouble arrived, disrupting the careful calm that had begun to settle over the pack. Elena had gone alone to the orchard in the late afternoon, a habit she had maintained since her earliest days at Shadowfang, needing the quiet solitude of the trees to think through the tangled emotions still occupying so much of her mind. She did not notice the figures moving through the trees until it was almost too late. The first indication came as a shift in the air, a sudden stillness among the birds that had been singing steadily throughout the afternoon. Elena's instincts, honed by years of pack training even if she had never faced true danger before, sent a jolt of alarm through her body a moment before she saw the first shadow move between the trees ahead of her. She turned quickly, intending to retreat toward the settlement, only to find a second figure emerging from the trees behind her, cutting off her path of escape. Both wore plain, unmarked clothing, deliberately concealing any affiliation, and the calculated positioning told Elena immediately that this was no accidental encounter. "Elena Voss," the nearer figure said, his voice carrying a false, unsettling calm. "You will come with us quietly, and no harm will come to you." Fear surged through her, sharp and immediate, but beneath it, something steadier began to rise as well. The training her own pack had instilled in her since childhood, however limited it might be compared to what Shadowfang's wolves received. "I do not know who sent you," she said, backing slowly toward the thicker cover of the orchard trees, buying herself precious seconds to think. "But you have made a significant mistake." The second figure moved closer, and Elena realized with rising dread that she was being deliberately herded, pushed away from any clear path back toward the settlement. She thought quickly, remembering the layout of the orchard from her daily walks, calculating whether she could reach the eastern wall, where a narrow gap in the fence line led toward the training grounds, close enough that a shout might reach the wolves stationed there. She did not wait for the men to close the distance further. Instead, she turned sharply and ran, cutting through the trees at an angle neither man seemed to expect, her lighter frame allowing her to move faster through the dense orchard growth than either of her larger pursuers. Behind her she heard sharp curses and the crash of branches as they gave chase, but she had gained precious ground with the sudden move, and she pushed herself harder, lungs burning, focused entirely on reaching the eastern wall. She burst through the tree line sooner than expected, stumbling into the open training grounds where a group of wolves were finishing their afternoon drills. "Help!" she shouted, her voice raw with exertion and fear. "Someone is after me!" The training grounds erupted into immediate motion, wolves dropping their practice weapons and surging toward her position, and Elena had only a moment to glance back toward the orchard before her pursuers vanished into the trees, apparently unwilling to risk direct confrontation with a full contingent of trained Shadowfang wolves. Within minutes, the alarm had spread through the entire settlement, and Damien arrived at the training grounds at a dead run, his expression carrying a fear Elena had not seen from him before, raw and unguarded in a way that spoke of far more than simple concern for a valued guest. "Elena," he said, reaching her in a few quick strides, his hands settling on her shoulders, as though needing to confirm with touch that she was truly unharmed. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine," she said, though her voice still trembled slightly, from the adrenaline coursing through her body. "Two men, in the orchard. They tried to take me, but I got away before they could." Damien's expression hardened into something dangerous, and he turned immediately toward the wolves gathering around them. "Search the eastern grounds, now. I want every inch of that orchard and the surrounding forest searched thoroughly. If they are still within our borders, I want them found." The wolves scattered to carry out his orders, and Damien turned back to Elena, his hands still resting on her shoulders, his expression softening as the immediate fear for her safety began to ease into something closer to relief, mixed with barely restrained fury at what had nearly happened. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I should have assigned you a guard the moment your father's audience revealed how serious this threat had become. I was too focused on strategy, on patrols along the border, and I failed to consider that the threat might come from within our own walls." "You could not have predicted this exact moment," Elena said, though she appreciated the depth of his concern. "And I am unharmed, Damien. Whatever they intended, I managed to escape it." "This time," Damien said grimly. "I will not allow there to be a next time. From this moment forward, you will not walk these grounds alone, not until we have identified who sent those men, and eliminated whatever threat they still pose to your safety." Elena wanted to protest the restriction, some part of her bristling instinctively at being told where she could and could not go within the settlement she had begun to consider, however cautiously, something close to a home. But the memory of those two figures moving through the orchard, calculated and clearly prepared for exactly this kind of opportunity, kept her protest quiet. Whatever independence she wanted to maintain, she understood the wisdom of caution in the face of a threat that had just proven itself willing to act directly against her. The search of the eastern grounds continued late into the evening, though the two men who had attempted to take her were never found. Having apparently escaped through some route the searching wolves could not identify before darkness made further tracking impossible. The failure to catch them left a heavy, unsettled tension hanging over the entire settlement, and that night, as Elena sat with Damien in his study reviewing what few details she could remember about her attackers, the full weight of the danger surrounding her finally settled fully into place. "Their clothing was deliberately unmarked," she said, recalling every detail she could manage. "But one of them spoke with an accent I did not recognize from anywhere in this region, something further south perhaps." Damien's expression grew thoughtful, troubled. "Victor Lang's territory lies to the south," he said slowly. "It would not be the first time he has employed mercenaries, specifically to avoid direct connection to attacks carried out on his behalf. You believe this was him?" "I believe it is very likely," Damien said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "If your father continued to resist his alliance proposal, Victor Lang may have decided that securing you directly would provide even greater leverage than any agreement your father could offer. A hostage taken from within Shadowfang's own walls would represent a significant blow to my authority, and would give him considerable power to negotiate whatever terms he desired, from either your father or from me directly." The full implications of the attempt settled heavily over Elena, and for the first time since her arrival at Shadowfang, she felt genuine, deep fear for her own safety, distinct from the emotional turmoil of the bond and the deception that had brought her here. Whatever game Victor Lang was playing, it had escalated far beyond testing borders and offering alliances. He had moved directly against her, and Elena understood clearly now that this danger would not simply fade away on its own. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Damien reached across the desk, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt entirely natural, despite the careful distance they had maintained over the past week. "We prepare," he said firmly, "and we make certain that whatever Victor Lang attempts next, he finds Shadowfang, and everyone within it, far better prepared to meet the challenge than he anticipates." Elena did not pull her hand away, finding an unexpected comfort in the warmth of his touch, the steady certainty in his voice. Whatever remained unresolved between them, whatever careful walls she still maintained around her own heart, she understood in that moment that she and Damien were now bound together by more than simple fate or debt. They were bound by a shared danger and a shared determination to face it together, whatever the cost might ultimately prove to be. Over the following days, the settlement transformed around her, every corner of Shadowfang adjusting to the new reality of an active threat within striking distance of its walls. Callum assigned 2 trusted wolves to accompany Elena whenever she left the Great Hall, quiet, watchful presences who kept a respectful distance while never letting her out of their sight. At first, the constant company grated against her, a fresh reminder of how quickly her freedom could be constrained by circumstances entirely outside her control. But as the days passed, she found herself growing accustomed to their presence, understanding it not as another form of captivity, but as a genuine effort to protect something Damien and his people had come to value. She spent long hours in the training yard as well, though not as a spectator this time. At her own request, one of the pack's senior instructors, a weathered wolf named Edmund who had trained fighters for over 20 years, began teaching her basic defensive techniques, ways to break free from a grip, ways to create the crucial seconds of distance needed to escape rather than fight outright. "You will never match a trained wolf in strength," Edmund told her bluntly, during their first session, "and I will not pretend otherwise to make you feel better about it. But strength is not the only tool available to you. Speed, awareness, the willingness to act decisively in the first moment of danger, rather than freezing in fear, these things can save your life, just as surely as raw power." Elena took to the lessons with a fierce determination that surprised even herself, pushing through the soreness and frustration of failed attempts until small victories began to accumulate, day by day. She thought often of those 2 figures in the orchard, of how close she had come to being taken, and the memory fueled her practice with an intensity that left her exhausted but satisfied by the end of each session. Damien watched her progress with evident pride, though he never pushed her toward training beyond what she chose for herself, respecting the boundaries of her own decisions, even as he remained visibly anxious about her safety. One evening, after a particularly difficult session that left her nursing a bruised forearm from a poorly executed block, he found her sitting near the edge of the training yard, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep shades of red and gold. "Edmund tells me you are progressing quickly," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I have good reason to learn quickly," Elena replied, flexing her sore arm carefully. "I do not intend to be caught unprepared a second time." Damien studied her profile for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "I admire your strength," he said quietly, "but I want you to know, Elena, that learning to defend yourself does not mean you must carry this burden entirely alone. Whatever training you gain, whatever skills you develop, I will still stand between you and danger whenever I am able. That has not changed, and it will not change." "I know," Elena said, and found that she meant it, the trust in her voice more certain than it had been even a week earlier. "But I would rather stand beside you in that fight than simply behind you, waiting to be protected. I think that is the difference that matters to me most." Something warm and unguarded crossed Damien's face at her words, and for a moment, the careful restraint he had maintained since revealing the truth of the bond seemed to waver, replaced by something rawer, more honest. "You continue to surprise me," he admitted, "every day, in ways I did not expect, even after 6 years of imagining what finding you might be like." "And are the surprises good ones?" Elena asked, a faint teasing note entering her voice, despite the seriousness of the days behind them. "The best kind," Damien said, and the warmth in his voice sent an answering warmth spreading through her chest, familiar now, no longer quite so unsettling as it had been that first night in the courtyard. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun finished its descent behind the mountains, and Elena found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Shadowfang, genuinely grateful for the strange, unexpected path that had brought her to this place, danger and uncertainty notwithstanding. Later that night, as she lay in her bed listening to the distant sound of night patrols moving along the settlement walls, Elena allowed herself to finally acknowledge a truth she had been resisting since the moment Damien first spoke of the bond between them. Whatever anger she still carried about the deception, whatever fear lingered from the attack in the orchard, something real and undeniable had taken root within her, growing steadily with every honest conversation, every quiet moment of shared vulnerability. She was not yet ready to name it fully, not yet ready to surrender completely to whatever fate had decided for her all those years ago, in a crowded, storm-lit hall. But she could no longer pretend the feeling did not exist, and for the first time, she found herself curious, rather than afraid, of where it might eventually lead. A week passed without further incident, though the vigilance across the settlement never fully relaxed. Elena continued her training with Edmund, her skills growing steadily with each session, and the constant presence of her two guards gradually became simply another part of her daily routine, rather than a source of frustration. She found herself settling into the rhythms of Shadowfang more completely than she had thought possible during those first uncertain days, learning the names of pack members beyond the head table, joining Odette in the healing quarters with increasing regularity, and slowly building a life that felt, for the first time since her father's fateful announcement, genuinely her own rather than something imposed upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Her relationship with Damien deepened as well, though carefully, without the rushed urgency the bond might have demanded had she allowed it. They spent their evenings together often now, sometimes discussing pack matters, sometimes simply talking about smaller things, childhood memories, favorite places within their respective territories, the small details that build genuine familiarity between two people learning each other properly for the first time. It was during one such evening, as they walked together along the eastern wall beneath a sky bright with stars, that Elena finally found herself ready to voice something she had been considering carefully for several days. "I have been thinking about the bond," she said, watching Damien's expression carefully as she spoke. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, something cautious and hopeful moving across his features in equal measure. "And what have you concluded?" Elena took a moment before answering, choosing her words with care. "I do not think I can separate what I feel for you now from what the bond might be creating within me," she admitted honestly. "But I have also come to realize that perhaps that separation does not matter as much as I once believed it did. The bond may have marked us as fated to find each other, but everything since then, every conversation, every moment of trust we have built together, that has been a choice, mine as much as yours." "What are you saying, Elena?" "I am saying that I do not want to simply accept this because fate decided it for us 6 years ago, in a hall neither of us fully remembers," she said, stepping closer to him. "I want to choose it, deliberately, with clear eyes, because of who I have come to know you to be these past weeks. Not because some ancient bond demands it, but because I want to." Something shifted profoundly in Damien's expression, the careful restraint he had maintained since their conversation in the study finally beginning to crack, replaced by something raw and deeply relieved. "I have waited 6 years to hear something close to those words," he said quietly, his voice unsteady with emotion he no longer seemed to be hiding. "But I need you to know, Elena, that I would have waited longer still, if that was what you needed. I did not bring you here expecting the bond alone to be enough. I hoped, every single day since your arrival, that you might come to choose this freely, in your own time. I know that now," Elena said softly. "I did not always believe it, but I do now." Damien reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch light and careful despite the intensity evident in his eyes. "May I kiss you?" he asked quietly, the question carrying a vulnerability Elena had not expected from a man whose name inspired such fear across the northern territories. Elena did not answer with words. She simply closed the remaining distance between them, and when their lips finally met, the warmth that had lived quietly beneath her skin since that first night in the courtyard blazed fully into something undeniable, a certainty that settled deep into her chest and left no room for doubt about the choice she had just made. Whatever fate had decided years ago, this moment belonged entirely to them, chosen freely, without coercion or obligation, and it felt, Elena realized, as they finally drew apart, like the truest thing she had experienced since arriving at Shadowfang. "I have wanted to do that since the night you arrived," Damien admitted, his forehead resting gently against hers, his voice carrying a rare, unguarded softness. "You hit it well," Elena said, a smile spreading across her face, despite the seriousness of the moment. "I had to," he said. "You needed time, and space, and the freedom to choose this without pressure. I was terrified of ruining that chance by moving too quickly." He pulled back slightly, studying her face in the starlight with an expression of quiet wonder. "I am grateful, more than I know how to properly express, that you chose to give me that chance regardless." They walked back toward the great hall slowly, hand in hand, the careful distance that had defined their relationship for the past weeks, finally beginning to dissolve into something warmer, more certain. Elena felt lighter than she had in weeks, the heavy uncertainty that had followed her since her father's fateful announcement finally beginning to ease, replaced by a genuine hope for the future she had not allowed herself to fully imagine until this moment. News of the shift between them spread quickly through the settlement over the following days, and Elena found herself greeted with increasing warmth by the pack members she encountered. The initial curiosity and caution that had marked her early days, gradually giving way to genuine acceptance. Even Callum, whose early hostility had already softened considerably, greeted her one morning with something that looked almost like approval as he oversaw the training grounds. "The king seems lighter these days," he observed, watching Elena move through her defensive drills with growing confidence. "I have not seen him this way in all the years I have served him." "I hope that is a good thing," Elena said, slightly breathless from her exercises. "It is," Callum confirmed. "A king who carries joy alongside his duty rules better than one who carries only the weight of duty alone. Whatever brought you to Shadowfang, Elena, I am glad it was you who arrived, and not simply the debt payment your father intended you to be." The warmth of acceptance from someone who had once regarded her with such open suspicion meant more to Elena than she expected, and she found herself smiling as she returned to her training, grateful for how completely her circumstances had shifted since that first frightened night in the courtyard. But even as her personal happiness deepened, the shadow of Victor Lang's ambitions never fully receded from the edges of settlement life. Reports continued arriving from scouts stationed along the southern border, describing increased activity within Ironclaw territory, troop movements that suggested preparation for something larger than simple posturing. Damien met with his commanders frequently to discuss these developments, and though he tried to shield Elena from the worst of his growing concern, she noticed the tightness that had returned to his shoulders during these strategy sessions, the careful way he chose his words whenever she asked directly about the situation. "You do not need to protect me from difficult news," she told him one evening, after catching him deliberately steering a conversation away from a scouting report that had arrived earlier that day. "I would rather understand the true shape of what we are facing than be comforted with half-truths." Damien studied her for a long moment, before finally relenting, spreading the scouting report across his desk for her to read directly. The details were troubling. Increased patrols along Ironclaw's northern border, unusual movements of supplies towards staging points that suggested preparation for military action, and most concerning of all, reports that Victor Lang had renewed contact with Elena's father, offering considerably more generous terms than his initial proposal. "He is not giving up," Elena said quietly, reading through the report a second time. "No," Damien agreed grimly. "If anything, the failed attempt to take you directly seems to have only strengthened his resolve. I believe he now understands that a more indirect approach, through your father's continued desperation, may prove more reliable than another attempt at direct action within our territory. What will you do?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing his response carefully. "I have already sent word to your father, offering the assistance we discussed, resources that might ease his pack's circumstances enough to remove Victor Lang's leverage entirely. But I confess I do not yet know if the offer will arrive in time, or if your father's resolve will hold long enough to consider it seriously, before Victor Lang applies further pressure." Elena felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, the fragile peace of the past week suddenly feeling far more precarious than it had only hours earlier. "And if my father accepts Victor Lang's offer regardless? Then we will face whatever consequences follow," Damien said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I will not pretend the path ahead is simple, Elena. but I promise you, whatever Victor Lang attempts, Shadowfang will meet it with everything we have, and I will not allow his ambitions to take from us what we have only just begun to build together." The resolve in his voice steadied something within her, and Elena found herself reaching across the desk to take his hand. The same gesture of quiet support he had offered her weeks earlier, now returned in kind. "Together then," she said firmly, echoing the promise they had made to each other during those first frightening days after the attack in the orchard. "Together," Damien agreed, and though the danger surrounding them remained as real and pressing as ever, Elena found a measure of genuine comfort in the certainty of his voice, in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone, and neither would he. The choice she had made beneath the stars along the eastern wall had been more than simply a romantic gesture. It had been a declaration that whatever came next, they would meet it as partners, bound not by fate alone, but by a deliberate, shared commitment that neither Victor Lang nor any other threat would easily break apart. In the days that followed, Elena found herself drawn increasingly into the practical business of pack leadership, sitting quietly at the edges of strategy meetings at first, then gradually offering her own observations as Damien and his commanders grew accustomed to her presence. Her outsider perspective, shaped by a smaller pack with fewer resources, often revealed considerations the Shadowfang commanders overlooked entirely, accustomed as they were to operating from a position of relative strength. "You keep assuming Victor Lang thinks the way we do," she pointed out during one such meeting, as Callum outlined a proposed strengthening of the southern watchposts. "But a pack that has spent years building strength through manipulation, rather than direct conflict, will not suddenly change its methods now, simply because his first attempts failed. He will look for the cracks, not the walls." Callum considered her words carefully, exchanging a glance with Damien, before nodding slowly. "She is right," he admitted. "We have been preparing for confrontation, when Lang has shown no genuine interest in confrontation at all. Every move he has made has been indirect, testing weaknesses rather than attacking strength directly. Then perhaps our energy is better spent identifying the cracks before he does," Damien said thoughtfully. "Rather than reinforcing walls, he has no intention of testing again so soon." The meeting shifted direction from there, and Elena found herself contributing more actively than she had expected, drawing on her knowledge of her father's pack, its vulnerabilities, the pressures that might make certain wolves within it susceptible to outside influence. It was strange, she thought, watching Damien and his commanders take her observations seriously, to find herself contributing meaningfully to decisions that would shape the safety of an entire pack, when only weeks earlier she had been nothing more than a debt payment delivered in a midnight carriage. Afterward, as the meeting concluded and the commanders filed out to carry their new orders forward, Damien lingered behind with her, studying her with open admiration. "You have a mind for strategy," he said. "I do not think even you fully realized that about yourself before today." "I spent my whole life watching my father make decisions that never seemed to account for the people they actually affected," Elena said. "I suppose I have simply been paying closer attention than most, waiting for the chance to do things differently." "You will have that chance," Damien said, something certain and warm in his voice. "More than you know." Elena caught the deeper meaning beneath his words, the quiet suggestion of a future she was only beginning to allow herself to imagine fully, one where she stood beside him not merely as a mate bound by fate, but as a genuine partner in leading this pack forward. The thought no longer frightened her the way it might have during her first uncertain days at Shadowfang. Instead, it settled into her chest with a quiet, steady sense of rightness, as though some part of her had been waiting, without fully realizing it, for exactly this kind of purpose. That evening, as she walked alone through the settlement before retiring for the night, her two guards trailing at a respectful distance, Elena found herself pausing near the orchard, where the attempted abduction had taken place weeks earlier. The memory no longer carried the same sharp edge of fear it once had, softened now by the weeks of careful training and the steady presence of people who had proven, again and again, their commitment to her safety. She thought of how far she had come since that first terrified night when her father's carriage delivered her to this unfamiliar place, and she found herself genuinely grateful, despite everything, for the strange and difficult path that had brought her here. The stars had begun to emerge above the mountains by the time she finally returned to her chambers, and as she settled into bed, Her thoughts drifted not toward the looming threat of Victor Lang, but toward the quiet certainty she had found in choosing Damien freely, beneath those same stars along the eastern wall. Whatever challenges awaited them in the days ahead, she understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed even a week earlier, that she was no longer simply enduring her circumstances at Shadowfang. She was building a life here, deliberately, one choice at a time, and for the first time since her father's fateful midnight announcement, that life felt entirely her own. The message arrived on a gray morning, carried by a rider whose horse looked close to collapse from the speed of its journey. Elena watched from the window of the great hall as the rider stumbled from his saddle, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, and she felt a cold certainty settle into her stomach even before Damien broke the seal on the letter he carried. She hurried down to the courtyard, arriving just as Damien finished reading, his expression darkening with each line. "What is it?" she asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. "Your father's pack," Damien said grimly. "Attacked 2 nights ago, under cover of darkness. The writer says the attackers wore no colors, but the tactics matched Ironclaw's known methods precisely. Your father is alive, but several of his wolves were injured defending the settlement, and considerable damage was done to the outer structures before the attackers withdrew." Elena's breath caught. This was a warning. A warning, or an opening move in a larger campaign, Damien said, folding the letter carefully. "Victor Lang has apparently grown impatient with negotiation. If he cannot secure your father's cooperation through promises alone, it seems he intends to secure it through fear instead." The implications settled heavily over the courtyard, and Elena felt her earlier confidence, built carefully over weeks of training and strategic planning, waver slightly beneath the weight of this new escalation. "We have to help them," she said firmly. "Whatever remains between my father and I, his pack does not deserve to suffer for his mistakes, and certainly not for mine." "I agree," Damien said without hesitation. "I have already ordered a contingent of our strongest wolves to prepare for immediate deployment. We will reinforce your father's defenses and ensure Victor Lang understands clearly that any further aggression toward that pack will be answered directly by Shadowfang." Within hours, the settlement had transformed into a hub of urgent preparation, wolves gathering supplies and weapons, Callum organizing the deployment with the same efficient precision Elena had come to associate with every aspect of Shadowfang's operations. She found herself caught between the desire to accompany the deployment, to see her former home and ensure her father's safety with her own eyes, and the practical understanding that her presence there would likely only provide Victor Lang with exactly the opportunity he had been seeking since her arrival at Shadowfang. Damien settled the question before she could raise it herself, finding her near the training grounds as the deployment prepared to depart. "I need you to remain here," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of someone anticipating resistance. "Not because I doubt your capability, but because your presence at your father's pack right now would be precisely what Victor Lang wants. If he cannot take you from within our walls, he may attempt to take you from the chaos of an active conflict instead." Elena wanted to argue, every instinct within her rebelling against the idea of remaining safely behind, while others faced danger on her behalf. But the logic of his words was undeniable, and she forced herself to nod, though the frustration remained evident in her expression. "Promise me you will be careful," she said instead, "and promise me you will send word the moment there is news, whatever that news might be." "I promise," Damien said, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace before releasing her to finish his preparations. "Callum will remain here, with a strong contingent to ensure your safety while I am gone. Trust him, Elena, as you have come to trust me." The deployment departed within the hour, leaving the settlement feeling strangely hollow, despite the wolves who remained behind to maintain its defenses. Elena spent the following days in a state of restless anxiety, throwing herself into training with Edmund and assisting Odette in the healing quarters as ways of managing the fear that threatened to overwhelm her whenever her thoughts drifted too long toward her father's pack, toward Damien, riding directly into whatever danger Victor Lang had prepared. It was on the 3rd night after the deployment's departure that the true danger finally revealed itself, not at her father's pack as everyone had expected, but within the walls of Shadowfang itself. Elena woke suddenly in the darkness, some instinct honed by weeks of careful training, alerting her to danger, before her conscious mind had fully registered what had disturbed her sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening carefully, and heard it again, the faint, deliberate sound of movement in the corridor outside her chambers, too quiet and too careful to be one of the regular night patrols. She rose quickly and silently, reaching for the small blade Edmund had insisted she keep near her bed since the incident in the orchard, her heart pounding as she crept toward the door. Through the small gap where the door met its frame, she could see shadows moving in the torchlight, more than one figure, moving with the same calculated stealth she remembered from the men who had ambushed her weeks earlier. Her mind raced through the options available to her. The window behind her led to a drop too steep to attempt safely in darkness. The door itself would lead directly into the path of whoever waited outside. She thought of Edmund's training, of the emphasis he had placed on awareness and decisive action in the crucial first moments of danger, and she forced herself to think clearly, despite the fear pounding through her veins. The door handle began to turn slowly, and Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe, blade ready, every muscle tensed for whatever came next. The door swung open slowly, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim torchlight of the corridor, and Elena did not hesitate. She struck quickly, exactly as Edmund had taught her, aiming not to cause serious harm, but to create the crucial seconds of distraction and pain that might allow her to escape. The figure staggered back with a muffled curse, and Elena did not wait to see what happened next. She bolted past him into the corridor, running toward the direction of the guard posts near the main hall, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor as she pushed herself faster than she had ever moved during her training sessions. Behind her, she heard the shouts of pursuit, at least two voices now, and the sound of running footsteps closing the distance far more quickly than she had hoped. She rounded a corner sharply, nearly colliding with one of the night guards who had clearly heard the commotion and come running to investigate. "They are in the western wing," she gasped, barely able to force the words out through her ragged breathing. "Sound the alarm." The guard did not hesitate, raising a horn to his lips and sounding a sharp, urgent signal that echoed through the entire settlement, followed almost immediately by the sound of the entire garrison springing into motion. Elena pressed herself against the wall as the guard moved past her toward the sound of the approaching pursuers, and within moments, the corridor filled with the chaos of combat, shouts and the clash of weapons ringing through the stone hallways. Callum arrived within minutes, moving through the chaos with the same commanding presence Damien typically carried, quickly organizing the scattered defenders into a coordinated response. He found Elena still pressed against the wall where she had taken shelter, and his expression shifted from fierce focus to genuine relief upon confirming she was unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely restrained fury at the breach of security. "I am fine," Elena said, though her hands trembled visibly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Two men, maybe more, came into my chambers. I managed to escape before they could take me." Callum's jaw tightened further, and he quickly issued a series of orders to the wolves gathered around him, sending groups to search different sections of the settlement, while others secured the perimeter walls. "This should not have been possible," he said, more to himself than to Elena, clearly running through every possible failure in the settlement's defenses that could have allowed intruders to penetrate this deeply. "Someone provided information about the layout of your chambers, about the timing of the patrols. This was not a random attempt." The implication settled coldly into Elena's chest. Someone within Shadowfang helped them. "It appears that way," Callum admitted grimly. "I will not rest until I identify who, I promise you that. But for now, our priority must be ensuring your safety. I am moving you to more secure quarters immediately, and I will not leave your side until this threat has been fully contained." The search continued through the remainder of the night, and by dawn, the settlement's defenders had managed to capture one of the intruders, though the others had apparently escaped through some breach in the perimeter that Callum's wolves were still working to identify. The captured man, when questioned, revealed little beyond confirming what everyone already suspected, that he had been hired by intermediaries with clear connections to Ironclaw territory, though he claimed no direct knowledge of Victor Lang's personal involvement. More troubling still was his confirmation that someone within Shadowfang had indeed provided information to facilitate the attempt, though he could not, or would not, identify who that person might be. The revelation sent a wave of unease through the entire settlement. Wolves who had lived alongside each other for years now, regarding one another with newfound suspicion, wondering who among their own ranks might have betrayed their trust. Word of the attack reached Damien within hours. Carried by a fast rider, Callum dispatched immediately after the situation had stabilized. Elena spent the following 2 days in a state of tense uncertainty, moved now to quarters deep within the most secure section of the Great Hall, surrounded by guards at all hours, waiting anxiously for word of Damien's return, and for any further developments in the search for the traitor within their own walls. Damien returned on the evening of the 3rd day, riding at the head of his deployment, with an urgency that suggested he had pushed his wolves to their absolute limit to return as quickly as possible. He found Elena in her new quarters, and the moment he saw her, whatever careful composure he had maintained during the ride shattered entirely, replaced by raw, unguarded relief as he crossed the room and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I should never have left," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have known Victor Lang would use my absence as an opportunity." "You could not have known," Elena said, though she held on to him just as tightly, comforted by his presence after days of anxious waiting. "And your father's pack needed help." "My father's pack," she corrected herself, the distinction feeling strangely significant even in this tense moment. "Both needed help," Damien said, pulling back slightly to study her face, checking for any sign of harm, despite Callum's earlier assurances that she remained unharmed. "But I will not make the same mistake twice. From this point forward, I do not leave this settlement without you beside me, or I do not leave at all." They spent the following hours reviewing everything that had happened during his absence, Callum joining them to detail the ongoing investigation into the traitor within their ranks and the continued search for the intruders who had escaped capture. The picture that emerged was troubling in its complexity, suggesting that Victor Lang's ambitions extended far beyond simple opportunistic attacks, revealing instead a carefully planned campaign that had likely been developing for weeks, perhaps longer. "He is patient," Damien said grimly, studying the reports spread across his desk. "Far more patient than I gave him credit for initially. This was never simply about testing our borders or pressuring your father. He has been building toward this moment since your arrival here, waiting for the right opportunity to strike directly at what he correctly identified as our greatest vulnerability." "Me," Elena said quietly. "Not you," Damien corrected firmly, taking her hand in his. "The love I have for you, which he has correctly identified as something he can attempt to exploit. That is a different thing entirely, and I will not allow him to twist it into a weakness rather than the strength it truly is." The words steadied something within Elena, and she found herself grateful, despite the exhaustion and fear of the past several days, for the clarity and determination in his voice. Whatever Victor Lang intended, whatever traitor still remained hidden within Shadowfang's walls, she understood now that facing this threat would require every ounce of the trust and partnership she and Damien had built together over the preceding weeks. The investigation into the traitor continued over the following days, Callum methodically questioning every member of the pack who might have had access to information about Elena's chambers and the patrol schedules that had been exploited during the attack. The process was slow and uncomfortable, casting suspicion over people who had served the pack faithfully for years, and Elena found herself wishing, more than once, that the truth would simply reveal itself without requiring this painful process of doubt and investigation to unfold. The breakthrough finally came, nearly a week after the attack, when Callum discovered discrepancies in the reports of a young wolf named Edric, who had served as a junior guard within the settlement for several years. Under careful questioning, Edric eventually confessed that he had been approached by an intermediary, offering substantial payment in exchange for information about the settlement's security arrangements. Payment, he claimed, was intended to help his aging mother, whose health had been declining for months, without the resources needed for proper care. The confession left Elena with a complicated tangle of emotions, anger at the betrayal, mixed with a reluctant, uncomfortable sympathy for the desperation that had apparently driven Edric's choice, a desperation not entirely unlike the one that had driven her own father toward his fateful decision months earlier. Damien handled the situation with a careful balance of justice and mercy that surprised her, exiling Edric from Shadowfang territory rather than imposing the harsher punishment tradition might have demanded, while also ensuring, through Odette's quiet intervention, that resources were provided to address his mother's medical needs, regardless of her son's actions. "Cruelty breeds more cruelty," Damien explained to Elena that evening, when she asked about his decision. "Edric made a poor choice, and he must face the consequences of losing his place within this pack. But punishing his mother for his desperation would only create more suffering, without making Shadowfang any safer in the process. I would rather rule through justice that considers the full circumstances of a situation than through punishment that simply satisfies anger without truly addressing the deeper problems that created it. The resolution of Edric's betrayal provided some measure of relief, closing at least one avenue of vulnerability within the settlement's defenses. But the larger threat of Victor Lang's ambitions remained unresolved, and as the days passed, Elena and Damien both understood that whatever peace they had found in each other, whatever quiet moments of happiness had grown between them since that night beneath the stars, would remain fragile until Victor Lang's threat had been fully and finally addressed. A letter arrived from her father shortly after Edric's confession, written in a hand shakier than Elena remembered, describing the aftermath of the attack on his own pack, and expressing a gratitude toward Shadowfang's assistance that felt, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely uncomplicated by any hidden agenda. He wrote that he had finally, formally refused Victor Lang's renewed offer of alliance, choosing instead to rebuild his pack's defenses with the resources Damien had provided, resources offered without condition or expectation of further leverage over Elena's future. Elena read the letter twice, sitting alone near the orchard where the first attempt against her had taken place weeks earlier, and found herself surprised by the tears that gathered in her eyes as she reached the final lines, where her father wrote simply that he hoped, someday, she might find it within herself to forgive him, though he understood if that day never came. She did not yet know how to answer him fully. The wound of his original betrayal remained real, not something that could be erased simply because he had finally made the right choice when it mattered most. But she found, reading his careful, uncertain words, that the sharp edge of her anger had softened considerably since those first bitter days after her arrival, replaced by something more complicated, a tired, weary understanding of a man who had made a terrible mistake out of fear, and who now seemed genuinely determined to make better choices going forward, whatever the cost to his own pride. She showed the letter to Damien that evening, watching his expression carefully as he read it. "What do you think I should do?" she asked, uncertain herself of the right path forward. "I think that is a decision only you can make," Damien said gently, setting the letter aside. "I will say only this. Forgiveness does not require forgetting what happened, nor does it require pretending the harm was smaller than it truly was. But sometimes it can offer a kind of freedom to the person extending it, releasing a weight they did not realize they were still carrying." He paused, studying her carefully. "Whatever you decide, Elena, I will support you fully, whether that means welcoming your father back into your life or maintaining the distance you have kept since your arrival here." Elena considered his words carefully over the following days, and though she did not reach a final decision immediately, she found herself drafting a careful reply to her father's letter, one that neither fully forgave nor fully rejected him, but simply acknowledged his words and expressed a cautious hope that time might eventually heal what remained broken between them. It felt, she thought as she sealed the letter for delivery, like a reasonable beginning, even if the ending remained uncertain. Meanwhile, the settlement's preparations against further threats from Victor Lang continued without pause. Damien called a war council of his most trusted commanders, Elena included now as a full participant rather than a quiet observer, to discuss the growing evidence of Ironclaw's continued aggression along the southern territories. Reports suggested Victor Lang had begun reaching out to smaller packs throughout the region, offering favorable terms in exchange for support against Shadowfang, a clear indication that he intended to escalate the conflict beyond isolated attacks and infiltration attempts into something far larger and more dangerous. "He is building an alliance of his own," Callum said grimly, laying out a map marked with the territories Victor Lang had reportedly approached. If even a portion of these smaller packs agree to support him, he could field a force considerably larger than anything we have needed to prepare for in recent memory. "Then we must build our own alliances in response," Damien said, his expression set with the same grim determination Elena had come to recognize during moments of genuine crisis. "I have maintained good relations with several packs along our northern and western borders. It is time to call upon those relationships properly, before Victor Lang's influence spreads any further." The council continued late into the night, mapping out a strategy that would require weeks of careful diplomacy, alongside continued vigilance against further direct threats. Elena listened intently, contributing where her knowledge proved useful, and found herself, despite the seriousness of the gathering danger, feeling a strange sense of purpose settle over her. The same steady resolve she had felt during her earliest training sessions with Edmund. Whatever Victor Lang intended, whatever scale of conflict his ambitions might ultimately demand, she understood now that she would face it not as a helpless bystander, but as someone with a genuine role to play in protecting the home and the people she had come, against every early expectation, to love. The weeks that followed the War Council brought a flurry of diplomatic activity to Shadowfang, envoys arriving and departing with regularity, as Damien worked to secure the alliances that would prove essential if Victor Lang's ambitions escalated into open conflict. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these diplomatic efforts, her fresh perspective, and her position as someone who had experienced the consequences of pack politics firsthand, proving unexpectedly valuable during negotiations with wary neighboring leaders. It was during a visit from the leader of a smaller northern pack, a cautious woman named Ophelia who had long maintained careful neutrality in regional conflicts, that Elena discovered a particular talent for building the kind of trust that formal diplomacy alone often struggled to achieve. "Your king speaks of alliance and mutual protection," Ophelia said during a private conversation Elena had requested, away from the more formal negotiations happening elsewhere in the Great Hall. "But I have heard such promises before, from leaders who forgot them the moment their own interests shifted. Why should I believe Shadowfang's commitment will prove any different?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I cannot promise you certainty about the future," she said honestly, "but I can tell you what I have witnessed since my own arrival here. I have seen this king choose difficult mercy over easy cruelty, even when cruelty would have been simpler. I have seen him protect people who owed him nothing beyond the accident of circumstance, simply because protecting them was the right choice to make. That is not proof of anything certain, but it is the closest thing to evidence I can offer you." Ophelia studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful moving behind her sharp, assessing eyes. "You speak of him with genuine conviction," she observed, "not simply the practiced loyalty of a mate reciting expected praise." "I speak of him as I have come to know him," Elena said simply. "Whatever else may be true about this arrangement, that much is genuine." The conversation seemed to shift something within Ophelia's careful calculations, and by the end of her visit, she had agreed to a preliminary alliance with Shadowfang, a small but significant victory in the larger effort to counter Victor Lang's growing influence. Damien praised Elena's role in securing the agreement warmly that evening, though Elena found herself more struck by how naturally the conversation with Ophelia had come to her, how genuinely she had believed every word she spoke about the man she had come to love. "You have a gift for this," Damien told her, as they walked together through the quiet courtyard after Ophelia's departure. "I do not think even you fully understood how persuasive, genuine conviction can be, compared to the careful, calculated words diplomacy usually requires." "I simply told her the truth," Elena said. "It is easier to be persuasive when you are not trying to construct something false." "That may be the wisest thing anyone has said to me about diplomacy in years," Damien said, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Perhaps I should send you to every negotiation from now on, and simply stay behind to handle the paperwork." Elena laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, a rarity that had become steadily more common in the weeks since she had chosen, beneath the stars along the eastern wall, to build this life deliberately, rather than simply endure it. "I think Shadowfang would fall into chaos rather quickly, without its king present for important decisions," she said. "But I am glad to help however I can." As the alliance building continued over the following weeks, gradually shifting the balance of power away from Victor Lang's ambitions, Elena found herself settling more fully into her role within the pack, no longer simply a guest or even a mate, but a genuine partner in the responsibilities of leadership. She began joining Damien for morning meetings with pack elders, learning the deeper history and traditions of Shadowfang, and slowly building the kind of comprehensive understanding that would prove essential to leading alongside him effectively. It was during one of these quiet mornings, as they reviewed reports together in his study, that Damien finally raised a question Elena had sensed building beneath the surface of their relationship for some time. "I would like to formally claim the bond between us," he said carefully, setting aside the reports he had been reviewing to give her his full attention. Not simply as a private understanding between the two of us, but through the proper ceremony our traditions require, acknowledging you publicly, as my Luna, my equal partner in leading this pack. Elena's breath caught slightly at the weight of the request, though she found, examining her own reaction honestly, that fear no longer formed any significant part of it. "You are asking me to marry you," she said, though her tone carried more warmth than surprise. "I am asking you to choose this fully, and publicly," Damien clarified gently. "I know we have already chosen each other privately, beneath those stars weeks ago, but I want the entire pack, and every rival watching from beyond our borders, to understand clearly that whatever began as a debt settlement has become something far more permanent, something no manipulation or threat can unravel." Elena considered the request carefully, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment. The fear and anger of her arrival, the slow, deliberate building of trust that had followed, the danger they had already faced together, and the greater danger that likely still awaited them. Every difficult step of that journey had led her here, to a choice she found, examining her own heart honestly, she was entirely ready to make. "Yes," she said simply, and watched the relief and joy bloom across Damien's face, unguarded in a way she had come to treasure over the weeks of their growing intimacy. "I choose this, Damien, fully and publicly, exactly as you have asked." The ceremony was arranged for several weeks later, giving time for the diplomatic efforts to continue, and for the pack to properly prepare for what would clearly become one of the most significant celebrations in Shadowfang's recent history. Elena found herself swept into preparations she had never imagined navigating, fittings for ceremonial clothing, discussions with pack elders about the traditional rites that would formalize the bond, and countless small details that Odette guided her through with patient, grandmotherly warmth. "I never had children of my own," Odette confessed during one such preparation session, carefully adjusting the fit of a ceremonial garment along Elena's shoulders. "But watching you these past weeks, watching the strength and grace you have shown through everything this pack has asked of you, I find myself feeling something very close to what I imagine a mother's pride must feel like. Whatever challenges still lie ahead, Elena, I am confident you will meet them exactly as you have met everything since your arrival here, with courage and clear eyes." The words moved Elena deeply, and she found herself embracing the older woman warmly, grateful for the kindness and guidance Odette had offered from those very first uncertain days at Shadowfang. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I do not think I would have found my footing here nearly as quickly without your patience." As the preparations continued, word arrived from the various packs Damien had approached for alliance, most responding favorably to the proposed partnerships, drawn in no small part by the genuine conviction Elena had demonstrated during her conversations with leaders like Ophelia. The growing coalition against Victor Lang's ambitions provided a measure of security that had not existed weeks earlier, though everyone involved understood clearly that the threat itself remained unresolved, merely delayed by the strengthening defenses now surrounding Shadowfang and its new allies. Callum, whose relationship with Elena had transformed entirely from suspicious hostility to genuine friendship over the preceding weeks, found her one evening reviewing final details for the approaching ceremony, and settled into the chair across from her with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "I owe you a proper apology," he said, "beyond the brief one I offered weeks ago. I judged you unfairly when you first arrived, seeing only a potential threat to everything I had helped build alongside the king. I did not understand, not truly, how much you would come to strengthen this pack rather than weaken it." "You do not owe me anything further," Elena said warmly. "Your caution was understandable, given everything you did not yet know. I am simply glad we found our way past it." "As am I," Callum said, a genuine smile crossing his usually serious features. "The king has found something rare in you, Elena. I hope you both understand how fortunate that truly is, especially given the darkness that so often defines pack politics in these territories." Elena thought of everything that had brought her to this moment, the fear and anger of her arrival, the careful trust built through honest conversation, the shared danger that had tested and ultimately strengthened the bond between her and Damien. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever final confrontation with Victor Lang might yet arrive, she found herself genuinely grateful for the strange, difficult path that had led her here, to a life she had never expected to want, now chosen fully and freely as entirely her own. "I understand it very well," she said quietly, and meant every word. The final days before the ceremony passed in a blur of quiet activity, the settlement transforming steadily as pack members decorated the great hall with garlands of late-season flowers and strung lanterns along every pathway leading toward the courtyard where the formal rites would take place. Elena watched the preparations unfold with a growing sense of wonder, still finding it difficult, even now, to fully believe that the frightened young woman who had arrived in a midnight carriage weeks earlier had somehow found her way to this moment, surrounded by people who had come to genuinely care for her welfare, preparing to celebrate a bond she had chosen freely and completely. 2 nights before the ceremony, Mira arrived unexpectedly at Shadowfang's gates, having traveled the long distance from Elena's former pack upon hearing news of the approaching celebration. Elena rushed to greet her old friend with a joy that surprised even herself, embracing Mira tightly in the courtyard, while the gathered wolves watched with warm curiosity. "I could not miss this," Mira said, laughing, as she finally pulled back to study Elena properly. "Look at you. You carry yourself so differently now, so much surer of yourself than the frightened girl I said goodbye to weeks ago." "A great deal has happened," Elena admitted, leading her friend toward the great hall to properly catch up on everything that had unfolded since their last conversation. Some of it frightening, some of it wonderful. I hardly know where to begin explaining it all. Over the following hours, Elena shared as much of her story as she could manage, the truth of the bond, the attacks and betrayals, the slow, careful building of trust, and eventually love between her and Damien, the growing threat of Victor Lang that still loomed at the edges of their newfound happiness. Mira listened with wide-eyed attention, occasionally gasping at particularly dramatic revelations, and by the end of the telling, she reached across to squeeze Elena's hand warmly. "I am so proud of you," she said, "for everything you have survived, and everything you have chosen to build despite it. Your father made a terrible choice sending you here, but it seems fate had far better plans than either of you understood at the time. Fate, and a great deal of hard work besides," Elena said with a small smile. "I do not think I could have found my way to this happiness without choosing it deliberately, every single day since my arrival." Mira nodded thoughtfully, understanding the distinction clearly. "That is the difference that matters most, I think. Fate may open a door, but walking through it, and building something real on the other side, that has always required courage that fate alone cannot provide." On the morning of the ceremony itself, Elena woke early, unable to sleep any longer, despite the late hour she had finally retired the night before. Odette arrived shortly after dawn to help with the final preparations, and as she carefully arranged Elena's hair and adjusted the final details of her ceremonial garment, the older woman studied her reflection in the small mirror with evident emotion. "You look every part the Luna this pack has been waiting for," Odette said softly. "Whatever nervousness you carry this morning, know that it will fade the moment the ceremony begins, replaced by nothing but certainty in the choice you have made." Elena studied her own reflection carefully, hardly recognizing the composed, radiant figure looking back at her, compared to the frightened young woman who had first arrived at these gates weeks earlier. "Thank you, Odette, for everything you have done to help me find my way here." "It has been my privilege," Odette said, her eyes bright with unshed tears of genuine happiness. "Now come. Your king is waiting, and I do not think either of you should keep the other waiting any longer than absolutely necessary." As Elena made her way toward the courtyard where the ceremony would take place, she caught sight of Damien standing near the center of the gathered pack, dressed formally for the occasion, and the moment their eyes met across the crowded space, every trace of nervousness that had lingered within her finally dissolved entirely, replaced by the same steady certainty she had felt that night, beneath the stars along the eastern wall. Whatever challenges still awaited them beyond this celebration, whatever final confrontation with Victor Lang might yet unfold, she understood clearly now that she was walking toward exactly the life she had chosen for herself, deliberately and completely, and nothing about that choice frightened her any longer. The ceremony began exactly as the sun reached its highest point above the mountains, warm golden light spilling across the courtyard, where the entire pack had gathered alongside representatives from every allied territory Damien had spent weeks courting. Elena walked slowly through the assembled crowd, her heart steady despite the weight of every eye following her progress, until she finally reached Damien's side near the center of the courtyard, where an elder wolf waited to conduct the formal rites of their tradition. The ceremony itself unfolded with a solemn beauty that Elena had not fully anticipated, ancient words spoken in a language older than either of their individual packs, promises exchanged that bound them not merely as mates, but as equal partners, entrusted with the well-being of everyone gathered to witness their union. When the elder finally pronounced them fully bonded, both by fate and by choice, the courtyard erupted into celebration, wolves howling in unison, a sound that rose into the clear afternoon sky, like a declaration carried across the entire northern territory. Damien pulled her close as the celebration continued around them, his expression carrying a depth of joy Elena had never seen from him before, even during their most intimate private moments. 6 years, he murmured against her ear, his voice thick with emotion. 6 years of searching, and every moment of it was worth reaching this day. I am glad your search finally ended somewhere good, Elena replied, smiling against the warmth of his embrace, the last traces of any lingering doubt about her choice, fully dissolved by the genuine, overwhelming happiness of the moment. The celebration continued long into the evening, feasting and dancing filling the great hall with a warmth Elena had never imagined possible during those first frightened days of her arrival. She danced with Mira, laughing freely for what felt like the first time in months, and accepted the warm congratulations of pack members she had come to know and genuinely care for over the preceding weeks. Even Callum, typically so serious and reserved, offered a rare, unguarded smile as he raised a toast to the newly bonded King and Luna, wishing them a long and prosperous future together. It was well past midnight, as the celebration finally began winding down, that the first sign of trouble arrived, shattering the joyful atmosphere with brutal suddenness. A watchtower guard burst into the great hall, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately silenced the remaining celebration. "My king," he gasped, clearly having run the entire distance from his post. Riders approaching from the south, a large force, moving quickly under cover of darkness. Our scouts estimate at least 3 times the number we prepared to expect from Ironclaw alone. The hall fell into stunned silence, the joy of moments earlier replaced instantly by tense, focused alertness. Damien's expression hardened immediately, the warm, unguarded happiness of the ceremony giving way to the sharp, commanding presence of a king facing genuine crisis. "Victor Lang has finally made his move," he said grimly, already turning toward Callum, who had similarly shifted from celebration to focused readiness. "Sound the full alarm. I want every wolf armed and positioned within the hour." The transformation of the settlement happened with remarkable speed. Wolves who had been dancing and feasting only minutes earlier, now moving with disciplined urgency toward their assigned defensive positions, the careful preparation of the preceding weeks proving its worth, as the entire pack shifted seamlessly from celebration into readiness for battle. Elena found herself swept along in the chaos, and when Damien turned to address her directly, his expression carried a complicated mixture of fierce protectiveness and grim acceptance of the fight now bearing down upon them. "I need you safe," he said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "Odette will take you to the secured chambers deep within the hall, along with the pack's children and elderly. I cannot properly focus on this battle while worrying for your safety in the open." Elena felt the familiar instinct to protest, the same frustration she had felt weeks earlier, when first restricted from moving freely through the settlement. But she thought of everything she had learned since then, of the training she had undertaken specifically to prepare for exactly this kind of moment, and she found herself shaking her head firmly. "I will not hide while you and everyone I love here face this danger alone," she said. "I have trained for weeks, specifically because I refuse to be a helpless bystander again. Let me help, Damien. Not on the front lines, perhaps, but somewhere I can contribute meaningfully to defending this pack." Damien studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect her fully and his growing respect for her capability and determination. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The healing quarters, then, alongside Odette. If this battle proceeds as I fear it might, we will need every skilled hand available to tend to the wounded. You have learned enough from her these past weeks to be genuinely useful there." Elena accepted the compromise, understanding the wisdom in it, even as every instinct urged her to fight alongside him directly. She embraced him fiercely, memorizing the feeling of his arms around her, before he turned to join Callum and the gathering defenders, and then she hurried toward the healing quarters, where Odette was already preparing supplies for whatever wounded the coming battle might bring. The next several hours passed in a haze of tense waiting, punctuated by the distant sounds of conflict, howls and shouts carrying faintly from the settlement's outer defenses, as Shadowfang's wolves met Victor Lang's advancing force at the perimeter walls. Elena worked alongside Odette, preparing bandages and remedies, her hands steady despite the fear coiled tightly in her chest, with every distant sound of battle. The first wounded began arriving within the hour, and Elena threw herself into tending them with a focus that helped keep the worst of her fear at bay, following Odette's instructions precisely as they worked to stabilize injuries and send the less severely wounded back toward the fight once they were able to continue. The work was grim and exhausting, but Elena found a strange steadiness in the purposeful action, grateful that her weeks of training with both Edmund and Odette had prepared her for exactly this kind of crisis. It was well into the early hours of the morning, when Callum himself arrived at the healing quarters. Blood streaked across his armor, though he moved with the controlled steadiness of someone not seriously wounded. Elena's heart lurched with fear at the sight of him. "Damien," she said immediately. "Where is he?" "Still fighting, and unharmed as of my last sight of him," Callum said quickly, easing her fear slightly. "I came only to report that our defenses are holding, though Victor Lang's force proved larger than our scouts initially estimated. The allied packs you helped secure have begun arriving to reinforce our position, which has turned the tide significantly in our favor." Relief flooded through Elena at the news, though the tension of the ongoing battle remained heavy in her chest. "How much longer do you think this will continue?" "Difficult to say with certainty," Callum admitted, accepting a quick bandage for a minor wound along his forearm as he spoke. "But Victor Lang's forces are clearly beginning to falter against our combined strength. I do not believe he anticipated the alliances we managed to secure these past weeks. If we can hold our current position through the next several hours, I believe the battle will turn decisively in our favor." Callum departed quickly to return to the fighting, and Elena forced herself back into the steady rhythm of tending the wounded, though her thoughts remained constantly with Damien, fighting somewhere beyond the walls of the healing quarters, facing dangers she could only imagine. The hours that followed felt endless, marked by the steady arrival of wounded wolves, and the distant, ongoing sounds of battle that gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to shift in tone, the desperate urgency of the earliest hours slowly giving way to something that sounded, cautiously, like the settlement's forces gaining the upper hand. As dawn finally began breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the sounds of battle finally began to fade entirely, replaced by an eerie, exhausted quiet that Elena did not know whether to interpret as victory or catastrophe. She waited anxiously alongside Odette, tending to the last of the wounded who had been brought in, until finally, the doors to the healing quarters opened, and Damien appeared, exhausted and bearing the marks of battle across his armor, but alive, and unmistakably victorious. Elena crossed the room to him without hesitation, and he pulled her into his arms with a fierce, exhausted relief that mirrored her own. "It is finished," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Victor Lang's forces have been routed entirely. Our allied packs arrived in time to overwhelm whatever advantage his numbers initially provided, and Victor Lang himself was captured attempting to retreat from the battlefield." "Captured," Elena repeated, hardly able to believe the threat that had shadowed their happiness for so many weeks had finally, truly, ended. "What will happen to him now?" "That will be decided by council among the allied leaders," Damien said. "But whatever punishment they determine, I believe we can finally consider this threat neutralized. Ironclaw's ambitions in this region have been thoroughly broken by tonight's defeat, and I do not believe any pack leader in these territories will soon forget the strength of the alliance we built to answer his aggression." The relief that flooded through Elena at these words felt almost overwhelming, after weeks of sustained tension and fear, and she found herself sagging slightly against Damien's chest, the accumulated exhaustion of the long night finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. He held her steady, his own exhaustion evident but secondary, for the moment, to his focus on ensuring her well-being after the long, difficult night. "You were extraordinary tonight," he murmured against her hair, tending the wounded, holding steady through hours of uncertainty. I am prouder of you than I know how to properly express. We were extraordinary, Elena corrected softly. This victory belongs to everyone who fought and worked together tonight, not simply to any single person among us. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, illuminating a settlement scarred but ultimately triumphant, word began spreading through Shadowfang of the battle's outcome, and slowly, cautiously, the exhausted relief of victory began transforming into genuine celebration once more, though far more subdued than the joyful festivities that had marked the ceremony only hours earlier. Wolves who had fought through the long night began returning from their posts, greeted with embraces and grateful tears, from families who had spent the darkest hours fearing the worst. Elena spent the following hours continuing to assist Odette with the wounded, though the urgency of the earlier crisis had given way to the steadier, more methodical work of proper recovery and healing. It was nearly midday before she finally had a moment to rest, and she found Damien waiting for her near the entrance of the healing quarters, having finally allowed himself a brief respite from the many responsibilities demanding his attention in the aftermath of the battle. "Walk with me," he said, offering his hand, and Elena accepted gladly, grateful for the chance to simply breathe alongside him after the exhausting intensity of the preceding hours. They walked together toward the eastern wall, the same path they had taken that night weeks earlier, when Elena had first chosen, freely and deliberately, to embrace the bond between them. The morning light illuminated the scars of the previous night's battle scattered across the settlement, damaged sections of the outer walls, patches of scorched earth where fires had briefly caught before being extinguished, but beneath the visible damage, Elena could sense something steadier and more permanent as well, the quiet, unmistakable strength of a pack that had faced its greatest threat and emerged, battered but fundamentally unbroken, on the other side of it. "Whatever comes next," Damien said quietly, as they reached the familiar stretch of wall where their story had first truly begun, "I believe we have finally earned the chance to build our future, without the shadow of Victor Lang's ambitions hanging over every choice we make. Whatever challenges still await us, and I have no doubt some will, I believe we are prepared to face them together, exactly as we have faced everything since your arrival here." Elena leaned into his side, watching the morning light play across the mountains beyond the settlement's walls, and found herself filled with a quiet, steady gratitude for every difficult step of the journey that had led her to this moment. "Together," she agreed softly, the word carrying all the weight and certainty it had gathered over the preceding weeks of shared trust, shared danger, and shared choice. "I would not have it any other way." 3 days later, the Allied leaders gathered within Shadowfang's Great Hall to determine Victor Lang's fate, and Damien invited Elena to sit beside him throughout the proceedings, honoring the promise he had made weeks earlier that she would stand as his equal partner in matters affecting the pack's future. Victor Lang himself was brought before the assembled council in chains, his once proud bearing considerably diminished by defeat, though his eyes still carried a cold, calculating resentment as he surveyed the gathered leaders who would decide his punishment. "You overreached," Ophelia said bluntly, her earlier caution about Shadowfang's alliance clearly replaced now by firm conviction after witnessing the battle's outcome firsthand. "Your ambition to expand Ironclaw's territory through manipulation and violence has cost you dearly, and I find myself with little sympathy for the consequences you now face." Victor Lang said nothing, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury at his own defeat, and the council proceeded to debate the appropriate resolution, weighing arguments for harsh punishment against the practical considerations of maintaining stability across the northern territories. Elena listened carefully throughout the discussion, and when Damien finally turned to her, inviting her perspective before the council reached its final decision, she found herself speaking with the same clear conviction she had discovered during her earlier diplomatic efforts. "Harsh punishment may satisfy our anger," she said, addressing the assembled leaders directly, "but I do not believe it will serve the long-term stability we all genuinely want across these territories. Ironclaw's people should not suffer indefinitely for the ambitions of a single leader who led them into a conflict he could not win. I would suggest instead that Victor Lang be stripped of his leadership entirely, replaced by someone within Ironclaw capable of rebuilding trust with the surrounding packs, while Victor Lang himself faces permanent exile, unable to threaten this region's stability ever again." The suggestion sparked further discussion among the council, but ultimately, After careful deliberation, the assembled leaders agreed to a resolution closely mirroring Elena's proposal, recognizing the wisdom in a punishment that addressed the immediate threat without condemning an entire pack to suffer for one man's failed ambitions. Victor Lang was formally stripped of his title and exiled from the Northern Territories entirely, while Ironclaw's leadership passed to a council of senior wolves, tasked with rebuilding the pack's relationships with its neighbors under considerably more cautious and cooperative terms. As the proceedings concluded and Victor Lang was led away under heavy guard, Damien turned to Elena with quiet admiration evident in his expression. "That was well reasoned," he said. "I do not think the council would have reached such a balanced resolution without your perspective guiding the discussion. I simply thought of what would actually serve everyone's future, rather than what might feel most satisfying in this immediate moment," Elena said. "I suppose I learned that lesson from watching how carefully you handled Edric's betrayal weeks ago." "Then perhaps we have taught each other well these past weeks," Damien said warmly, and Elena found herself smiling at the truth of it, at how thoroughly their partnership had grown from that first tense, frightened encounter in the courtyard into something built on genuine mutual respect and shared wisdom. In the days that followed, as Shadowfang settled into the steady work of recovery and the Allied leaders returned to their own territories, word of the battle's outcome and the wisdom of its resolution spread quickly throughout the northern regions. Elena's reputation grew alongside Damien's, wolves throughout the territory speaking with genuine admiration of the Luna, who had helped secure crucial alliances and guided a council toward a resolution that balanced justice with practical wisdom. It was a reputation she had never sought, having arrived at Shadowfang weeks earlier as nothing more than a debt payment delivered in a midnight carriage, but one she found herself genuinely proud to have earned through her own choices and actions. Her father sent word shortly after news of the victory reached his pack, expressing relief at Shadowfang's success and, more importantly, offering a genuine, uncomplicated apology that finally seemed to carry the full weight of understanding rather than mere desperate justification. Elena read his letter carefully, and this time, she found herself ready to respond with something closer to the forgiveness he had asked for weeks earlier, not because the original wound had fully healed, but because she recognized, in his careful words, a genuine effort to become a better man than the one who had traded her away in fear and desperation. She composed her reply that evening, sitting beside Damien in his study as the fire crackled warmly nearby, and found the words came more easily than she expected, an acknowledgement of the pain his choice had caused her, alongside a genuine hope that they might slowly rebuild something resembling trust between them, one honest conversation at a time. As she sealed the letter for delivery, she felt a quiet sense of closure settle over her. One final piece of the difficult journey that had brought her to Shadowfang finally finding its proper resolution. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of the preceding days, Elena wandered out into the quiet garden behind the Great Hall, the same place where Odette had found her weeks earlier, struggling to process the truth of the bond for the first time. The garden looked different now in the gentle moonlight. The early season flowers that had bloomed during her arrival, long since given way to the fuller, richer growth of high summer, and Elena found herself struck by how completely her own life had transformed, alongside the changing seasons. She thought of the frightened young woman who had first walked these grounds, uncertain of everything, braced for cruelty at every turn, and found it strange, almost dreamlike, to compare that memory against the woman she had become in the weeks since. She had learned to defend herself, learned to speak with conviction in rooms full of powerful leaders, learned to love freely and deliberately, rather than simply accepting fate's decision without question. Every difficult step of that transformation had been earned through genuine choice, and she found herself deeply grateful, sitting alone beneath the same wide oak tree where she had once processed her anger and confusion, for every hardship that had ultimately led her toward this steadier, stronger version of herself. Damien found her there some time later, having apparently noticed her absence from their shared chambers, and followed some quiet instinct toward the garden. He settled onto the bench beside her, without a word at first, simply taking her hand in his familiar, comfortable silence. "Do you ever wonder," Elena said finally, breaking the peaceful quiet between them, "what might have happened if my father had never fallen into debt? If the arrangement that brought me here had never existed at all?" Damien considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I have wondered that. More than once," he admitted. I do not know if I would have found you otherwise, or how many more years I might have spent searching gatherings for a woman whose face I could barely remember. Perhaps we would have found each other regardless, through some other path entirely. Perhaps we would not have. I confess I find the uncertainty of it somewhat unsettling to consider too closely. I used to resent the circumstances that brought me here, Elena said quietly. I still resent how my father made the choice for me, without ever asking what I wanted. But I find I can no longer fully resent the outcome itself, however strange and difficult the path toward it proved to be. She turned to study his face in the moonlight. Warmth and certainty settled deep in her chest. I do not know if I believe entirely in fate, Damien, but I believe, without any doubt at all, in the choice I made to build this life with you, deliberately, one difficult step at a time. That is enough for me, Damien said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Fate may have opened the door years ago, in a crowded hall neither of us fully remembers. But everything we have built since then, every difficult, wonderful moment of it, that has always belonged entirely to us. They remained together in the quiet garden for a long while longer, content simply to sit in each other's presence beneath the stars, the weight of the recent battle and its aftermath finally beginning to ease into the steadier rhythm of a future they had both chosen freely, and were now prepared to build together, whatever challenges it might yet bring. Autumn arrived at Shadowfang with a gentle transformation of color across the surrounding mountains, the deep greens of summer giving way slowly to brilliant shades of gold and amber that Elena found herself admiring during her now regular morning walks through the orchard. Nearly 2 months had passed since the defeat of Victor Lang's forces, and the settlement had settled into a steady, prosperous rhythm that felt, to Elena, like the truest fulfillment of everything Damien had promised her during those first uncertain days of her arrival. The alliance she had helped secure with Ophelia's pack, along with several other territories that had joined the coalition against Ironclaw's aggression, had proven remarkably durable, beyond the immediate crisis that first brought them together. Regular trade had developed between the allied packs, along with a genuine spirit of cooperation that Damien credited, more than once, to the foundation Elena had helped establish through her honest, heartfelt diplomacy during those tense weeks of preparation. Ironclaw itself had begun the slow, careful work of rebuilding under its new council leadership, and reports suggested the pack's relationships with its neighbors had improved considerably since Victor Lang's exile, freed finally from the ambitious manipulation that had defined its recent history. Elena felt a quiet satisfaction whenever such reports reached Shadowfang, grateful that the resolution she had proposed weeks earlier had genuinely served the long-term stability of the entire region, rather than simply satisfying a desire for immediate punishment. Her relationship with her father continued its slow, careful rebuilding as well. Letters exchanged regularly now, each one bringing them incrementally closer towards something resembling genuine trust. He had visited Shadowfang once more during the autumn months, a considerably more comfortable audience than their previous encounters, and though the deep wound of his original betrayal remained a permanent part of their shared history, Elena found herself genuinely glad of the effort he continued making to become a better man, a better father, than the desperate one who had traded her away in fear months earlier. It was on a crisp morning in late autumn that Damien called Elena to his study, his expression carrying an anticipation she had come to recognize as the precursor to significant news. She found him standing near the window, watching the activity in the courtyard below with a thoughtful expression that shifted into warm affection the moment he noticed her arrival. "The pack elders have proposed something," he said, gesturing for her to join him near the window. "A formal coronation, recognizing you not simply as my mate and Luna, but as a full and equal ruler of Shadowfang, sharing the throne alongside me, rather than standing beside it." Elena felt a mixture of surprise and quiet pride at the proposal, thinking of how far she had traveled from that frightened young woman who had first arrived here, uncertain of her place in a world that had seemed, at the time, entirely beyond her control. "Do the elders truly believe I have earned such a position?" "They believe it wholeheartedly," Damien said, taking her hands in his. "As do I, more than I know how to properly express. You have proven yourself, Elena, not simply through the bond that first brought us together, but through every difficult choice you have made since your arrival here. The alliance that saved us from Victor Lang's ambitions, the wisdom that guided his fair punishment, the healing quarters, where you spent that long, terrible night tending our wounded. Every part of this pack's recent success has been shaped by your genuine contribution. I can think of no one more deserving of sharing this throne fully and equally." Elena considered the proposal carefully, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment. The fear and anger of her arrival, the slow, deliberate choice to build trust and love with a man she had never expected to find, the shared dangers that had tested and ultimately strengthened everything between them. Every difficult step of that journey had led her here, and she found herself, examining her own heart honestly, entirely ready to accept this final, formal recognition of the partnership they had built together. "Yes," she said simply, echoing the same certainty that had carried her through every significant choice since her arrival at Shadowfang. "I accept, Damien, fully, and with genuine gratitude for everything this pack, and you, have given me since that first frightened night I arrived here." The coronation was arranged for the following month, timed to coincide with the traditional autumn harvest celebration that drew participants from every corner of Shadowfang's territory, along with representatives from each of the allied packs that had joined together against Victor Lang's aggression months earlier. Elena found herself, once again, swept into preparations for a significant ceremony, though this time with a confidence and steadiness that had been entirely absent during those first uncertain weeks after her arrival. On the morning of the coronation, Elena woke early, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold through her chamber window, and found herself thinking, with quiet gratitude, of everything that had led her to this remarkable moment. She thought of her mother's pendant, still worn faithfully beneath her collar since the night her father first pressed it into her palm, and wondered, not for the first time, whether her mother would have been proud of the woman she had become, forged through hardship and difficult choice, into someone capable of standing as an equal ruler alongside the man she had come to love so completely. Odette arrived to help with the final preparations, her eyes bright with the same grandmotherly pride she had shown weeks earlier during Elena's bonding ceremony. "I have served 3 rulers of this pack across my long life," she said softly, carefully arranging the ceremonial crown that would formally mark Elena's new position. "I have never seen one arrive through circumstances quite so difficult as yours, nor one who has grown into her role with quite such remarkable grace. Whatever the future holds for Shadowfang, I believe it rests in genuinely capable hands." "Thank you, Odette," Elena said, embracing the older woman warmly. "For everything you taught me, and everything you believed in me, from that very first uncertain morning." As the ceremony began, Elena walked through the gathered crowd toward the raised platform, where Damien waited, his expression carrying the same warm pride and love she had come to treasure over the preceding months. The elder wolf who had conducted their bonding ceremony months earlier now presided over this second, equally significant rite, speaking ancient words that formally recognized Elena's position as full and equal ruler of Shadowfang, sharing every responsibility and every honor alongside the man she had chosen to build this life beside. When the ceremony concluded and the crown was formally placed upon her head, the assembled crowd erupted into celebration, wolves howling in unison across the courtyard, joined by representatives from every allied pack who had traveled to witness this remarkable culmination of everything that had unfolded since that first tense night when Elena arrived as nothing more than payment for her father's debt. Damien took her hand as the celebration continued around them, pulling her close, as he had done so many times over the preceding months, and Elena found herself overwhelmed with a quiet, profound gratitude for the strange, difficult path that had brought her to this moment. "They sold you to a rival pack," Damien murmured softly against her ear, echoing the bitter phrase that had first defined her arrival at Shadowfang. "But I had been waiting for you all along, Elena. Every difficult day of these past months, every danger we faced together, every choice you made freely, despite every reason you might have had to walk away instead, all of it led us here, to exactly the life I dreamed of finding, 6 long years ago, in a crowded hall neither of us fully remembers." "I am glad your search finally found its way to me," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion as she looked out over the celebrating crowd, over the pack she had come to love as deeply as the man standing beside her. "Whatever brought me here, whatever fate or circumstance first set this story into motion, I know now, without any doubt at all, that everything since has been built by choice. My choice, freely made, again and again, until this life became entirely my own." As the celebration stretched into the evening, the great hall filled with warmth and laughter that felt, to Elena, like the truest fulfillment of the family and belonging she had feared losing entirely on that frightened midnight so many months ago. She thought of Mira, dancing joyfully nearby with one of the young Shadowfang wolves she had befriended during her visit for the bonding ceremony. She thought of Callum, standing proudly near the edge of the celebration, his earlier suspicion transformed entirely into genuine loyalty and friendship. She thought of Odette, watching the festivities with quiet, grandmotherly pride, and of her father, who had sent warm congratulations along with a promise to visit soon, now that the careful work of rebuilding trust between them had finally begun bearing genuine fruit. Every difficult step of her journey, every fear and danger and painful choice, had led her here, to this remarkable life she had built deliberately, with courage and clear eyes, alongside a man who had waited patiently for her to choose him freely, rather than simply accepting what fate alone had decided. As the stars emerged fully above the celebrating settlement, Elena stood beside Damien, her partner and equal in every sense that truly mattered, and felt, for the first time since that terrifying midnight knock so many months earlier, entirely and completely at home. Later that night, as the Great Hall celebration continued in full swing, Damien led Elena quietly away from the crowd, out through a side door, into the same garden where they had shared so many of their most meaningful conversations over the preceding months. The autumn air had grown cool with the late hour, and Damien settled a warm cloak over Elena's shoulders as they walked slowly beneath the wide oak tree, its leaves now turned brilliant shades of gold and red against the darkening sky. "I have something for you," Damien said, reaching into his coat and producing a small wooden box, carefully carved with symbols Elena recognized from Shadowfang's oldest traditions. It belonged to my mother, passed down through generations of this pack's rulers, given traditionally to the Luna upon her formal coronation. Elena opened the box carefully to find a delicate silver bracelet inside, its design featuring a small crescent moon that immediately reminded her of the pendant she still wore beneath her collar, the one her own father had given her on the night everything began. "It is beautiful," she said softly, studying the careful craftsmanship. "Thank you, Damien." "There is a tradition attached to it," he continued, watching her expression carefully. "It is meant to be given not simply as decoration, but as a symbol of partnership, a reminder that whatever challenges a ruling pair might face, they carry that weight together, never alone." He took the bracelet gently and fastened it around her wrist, his fingers lingering warmly against her skin. "I cannot think of anyone more deserving of carrying that reminder than you, Elena. You have never once let me carry this burden alone, not since that very first night you arrived here, still afraid, but already determined to find your own strength within impossible circumstances." Elena studied the matching symbols, her mother's pendant and now this new bracelet, both marked with the same crescent moon, that seemed to connect the two most significant relationships of her life across the strange, difficult path that had brought her here. "I think my mother would have loved this pack," she said quietly. "I think she would have been proud of the life I have built here, even given how difficult the beginning of that path truly was." "I believe she would have been," Damien agreed softly, pulling her close against his side as they continued their slow walk through the moonlit garden. "Just as I believe, whatever trials the future may yet bring to Shadowfang, we are prepared to meet them now, not simply as fated mates bound by circumstances beyond our control, but as genuine partners who chose this life, and each other, freely and completely." They walked together for a long while longer, the distant sounds of celebration drifting softly from the great hall behind them, and Elena found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled since that frightened midnight knock so many months earlier. She thought of the young woman who had stood trembling in a moonlit hallway, certain her life was ending in one way and beginning in another, and found herself grateful, beyond any words she could properly express, for every difficult step of the journey that had led her to this exact moment, standing beside a man who had waited 6 long years for the chance to love her properly, in a pack that had become, against every early expectation, genuinely and completely her home. As they finally made their way back toward the celebration, ready to rejoin the pack that had welcomed her so completely into its fold, Elena paused once more beneath the wide branches of the old oak tree, looking back at Damien with a warmth and certainty that had grown steadily, deliberately, choice by choice, since that very first tense encounter in the torchlit courtyard. The story that had begun with betrayal and fear had transformed, through patience and honest choice, into something far greater than either of them had dared to imagine during those first uncertain days. Not simply a debt settled, or a fate fulfilled, but a genuine partnership built through shared trial, shared trust, and a love chosen freely, again and again, until it became the truest and most permanent foundation of both their lives. And as the celebration continued long into the night beneath a sky bright with stars, Elena understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since her arrival at Shadowfang, not as someone who had been sold or given away, but as a woman who had chosen, deliberately and completely, the remarkable life now entirely her own.